The first thing you notice up here is the silence. Not real silence. There's no such thing. I learned that fast. But the kind that sits on top of everything like a lid. Wind through the tree line. A crow doing something a quarter mile east that I haven't figured out yet. Occasionally something below in the dark that I don't investigate anymore unless I hear it for more than 3 seconds consecutively. Because 3 seconds means it found something, and finding something means it'll attract others. I'm writing this from the fire lookout tower at Hammond Ridge. The real name on the Forestry Service map is Lookout Station 7. Hammond Ridge is what the locals called it, and since there aren't really locals anymore in any practical sense of that word, I guess the name's mine to use however I want. The tower sits about 60 feet off the ground on steel legs that were bolted into the granite sometime in the late 50s. The cab up top is roughly 14 by 14 feet. Single room. 1 door. Wraparound catwalk with a railing that I've reinforced with paracord, and 2 sections of chain link fencing I hauled up here in 3 separate trips, and probably shouldn't have, because my right shoulder still hurts from it. Below me, 360 degrees of mixed conifer forest. The access road that used to serve this place runs about 4.5 miles back down to State Route 9, and I've blocked it in 2 places now. The first block is a felled Douglas fir across the road at the half-mile mark. The second is a salvaged gate from the Bellamere Ranch property I dragged out here with the pickup 2 weeks ago and chained to a boulder on each side. Neither of those stops a determined person with tools, but the infected don't carry tools, and anyone thinking clearly, would see the blockages and understand they're intentional, that they mean something, which is the point. I've been up here for 6 weeks. 7, now, if I count the half week I spent getting the place livable before I actually committed to it. I have a portable radio setup running on a deep cycle marine battery that I recharge with a solar panel bungee corded to the south-facing railing. I have food for maybe 3 more weeks if I'm careful, which I am. I have water from a 60-gallon drum I rolled up the access road in the pickup bed and then winched, manually, with a block and tackle I cobbled from the tower's old maintenance hardware, up to the catwalk. Rain catchment supplements that when it rains, which in the Pacific Northwest in July means not as often as you'd think. The others are in the structures I'll describe later. Down below, in what used to be the Forestry Service equipment shed and the small ranger cabin, about 40 yards from the base of the tower. I can see the cabin roof from up here. 2 windows face the clearing. We've worked out a light signal system. Flashlight. 3 blinks means I need something. 1 long means come up. No light at all, just means everything's fine and I'm watching. The light in the left window right now is dark. Everything's fine. I'm watching. Let me tell you how this started. Let me tell you how it started for me. The actual start, the 0 point, whatever happened in whatever lab or slaughterhouse or wet market or government facility, pick your theory. I don't know. I've heard things on the radio. I've heard about 12 different explanations from 12 different people, and none of them agree on anything, except the part where everything went wrong very fast. I'm a communications technician by training. I spent 6 years in the Army working in Signal Corps, which means I know how to set up radio networks, and I know how people use radio when they're panicking, and I know the difference between information and noise. The first few weeks after the outbreak, it was almost entirely noise, and I don't mean that dismissively. I just mean that when you strip away the people screaming and the theories and the official-sounding broadcasts that contradicted each other every 12 hours, there wasn't much left that you could actually use. What I know, personally, from what I heard and what I saw, whatever this is, it moves fast. Someone gets bitten. The wound does something. I've watched it twice now, up close, which is 2 times more than I wanted to, and within about 4 to 8 hours, depending on the person's size and where they were bitten, and probably a dozen other variables I can't account for, they're gone. Not dead gone, changed gone. The thing that's left behind still moves, still reacts to sound and movement, still follows you if it hears you, but there's no one home. I've looked at faces I recognized, and I know there was nobody behind those eyes anymore. That sounds like something people say in movies, but I mean it as an observation. Clinical. The lights are out. They don't strategize. They don't communicate. They don't open doors or climb stairs or check corners. They walk toward sound. If you're quiet, they walk past you. If you make noise, enough of them gather that it becomes a problem, measured in hundreds rather than ones and twos. They bite. They don't seem to feel pain in any meaningful way. Hitting them in the body accomplishes nothing permanent. The head is the only reliable option, which I say, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has confirmed this more times than he wanted to. That's what they are. Now let me tell you about July 12th. July 12th was a Saturday. Clear sky, maybe 83 degrees by late afternoon. The kind of humid, but not miserable Pacific Northwest summer evening that everybody in this region spends all winter waiting for. The Ridgemont Community Fireworks Festival was an annual thing, not a small one. The park covers something like 40 acres, and the event draws people from 3 counties. My sister Lily had been bugging me to go for 2 years running because the previous 2 years I'd had work things or personal inertia things that had kept me home. And this year, she'd basically made the decision for me by buying tickets in February and putting them on my refrigerator with a magnet that said, "Plans are made to be kept," which she'd found at a thrift store and thought was funny. Lily is 20 years old, pre-med at the University of Oregon, home for summer break, staying at my place because our parents' house has our mother's boyfriend in it, and our mother's boyfriend is the kind of person that neither Lily nor I can be around for more than about 40 minutes without losing some portion of our composure. Lily is sharp. I don't say that like a proud older brother who's not paying attention. I say it as an honest assessment of a person I've known for her entire life. She has a way of watching things that reminds me of the way a good field intel guy watches a grid square. Patient, gathering, not jumping to conclusions but also not missing much. She was studying emergency medicine because she wanted to work in trauma, which, as it turned out, was either excellent or terrible timing, depending on how you look at it. We got to the park around 6. The fireworks weren't until 9:30. The intervening 3.5 hours were the usual county fair experience. Food trucks, a local band playing covers on a flatbed stage, kids with glow sticks, the particular smell of funnel cake and cut grass, and somebody's citronella candle losing the fight against the mosquitoes. I had a pulled pork sandwich that wasn't worth what they charged for it. Lily had a lemonade and a corn dog and found 3 people she knew from high school within 20 minutes, which tells you something about the difference between us socially. I was fine. I want to be clear that I was fine. I was having an okay time. I was watching the band not particularly carefully, and drinking a beer that was warm by the time I got to the bottom of it, and checking my phone the way you do when you're at an event that's between activities. I had my radio with me, a Baofeng UV5R, handheld, dual band. I carry it almost everywhere, which is a habit from the army that I've never fully shaken. Most people who know me think it's a quirk. A few people who know me well enough think it's a problem. Maybe they're right, but it was on my belt at the park that night, and that radio is a direct reason that Lily and I are both still alive. At around 9:15, I turned the squelch down on the radio, half out of habit, and half because I drifted toward the perimeter fence near the park's maintenance area, and I was bored enough to scan frequencies. There's a certain kind of peace in scanning. The white noise between stations, the occasional burst of someone's local repeater traffic, weather stations doing their steady loop. It was something to do while I waited for the fireworks to start. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a full transmission, a fragment. Maybe 4 seconds of broken audio that came in on a frequency I wasn't expecting anything on. Somewhere in the upper VHF range that local emergency services sometimes use for coordinating logistics events. I almost scrolled past it. The audio was clipped and half buried under interference, and whoever was speaking was talking fast, the way dispatch people talk when they have more to say than they have time to say it. What I caught was contact with multiple subjects, non-responsive to Park District Security requesting immediate, all units, and then it was gone. Squelch kicked back in. I stood there for a second with the radio in my hand. Park District Security requesting immediate all units. That's not a strange transmission in isolation. Events have security. Security has radio. Security requests backup. But the frequency was wrong. That wasn't a venue security frequency. That was an emergency services auxiliary, the kind of channel that gets used when the main channels are saturated. And the tone of the voice wasn't normal event security some drunk guy is causing trouble tone. I've been around enough military and emergency communications to have a feel for when someone is actually scared versus when someone is professionally tense. And what I'd heard was the former, clearly. I scanned back to the same frequency and got nothing but static. I stood there another few seconds and told myself I probably misheard it. I told myself the fragment could mean a dozen different things, and jumping to conclusions on 4 seconds of partial audio in a noisy environment was exactly the kind of thing that gets people embarrassed. I put the radio back on my belt. I went and found Lily with her group of high school people and stood on the edge of that conversation and watched the stage and told myself it was nothing. 5 minutes later, the first firework went up. A red starburst that popped and scattered 200 feet over the field and got the crowd going. That familiar collective sound, the held breath, then the exhale of appreciation, then the kids shrieking. Lily grabbed my arm with both hands, the way she's done since she was about 4 years old. And that's when I heard the gunshot. It was maybe 200 yards away, maybe less. A single crack that was close enough in pitch to the firework that had just gone off, that I suspect most people wrote it off as a stray bang from the show. The fireworks are unpredictable in terms of sound. Some of them crack sharp, some of them boom low. Some of them have this weird ricocheting echo that comes off the tree line on the park's north side. A single gunshot in that noise would be almost impossible to distinguish if you weren't listening for it. I was listening, not because I'm psychic, and not because I had any specific reason to be on alert. I was listening because I'd heard that radio transmission 5 minutes earlier, and my brain had filed it in the part of the cabinet labeled, "Do not ignore this." And when you've spent 6 years in an environment where certain sounds mean certain things, the training doesn't leave you. It just goes quiet for a while, and then it's there when you need it. I said, "Lily." She heard something in my voice. She turned away from her friends immediately. I said quietly, "I need you to come with me right now. Don't make a face and don't say anything loud." She looked at me for 1 second. Her expression didn't change. Not alarm, just calculation. The same rapid internal adjustment I'd seen her make in other situations when I'd said something unexpected. She said, "Okay," and peeled her hands off my arm. I took her wrist and walked toward the maintenance gate. Here's what I knew. The park had a service perimeter. I'd noticed it when we came in, because I always notice that kind of thing. Fence line, access points, where the vehicles go that aren't crowd vehicles. There was a chain-link gate on the east side of the main field with a push-bar lock and a sign that said, "No admittance, staff only." It was the kind of lock that's designed to stop regular people from wandering through, not to stop someone who's been trained to move through contested spaces quickly. I wasn't planning to break anything. I just wanted to be on the other side of that fence before whatever was happening got closer. Another firework went up, then another. The crowd settled into the show, everyone looking skyward, the collective attention fully redirected upward. Behind us, the crowd was packed maybe 30, 40 deep from the main viewing field, all the way back to the food trucks. I hit the maintenance gate at a walking pace, hooked my hand around the push bar, and didn't break stride. The lock clicked open. The gate swung inward. Lily followed me through without a word, and I pulled it shut behind us. The maintenance area on the other side was a gravel access lane, wide enough for a utility truck, bordered on one side by a chain-link fence, and on the other by a corrugated metal storage building about the size of a double garage. 2 Park Service ATVs were parked beside it. A coil of orange extension cord sat next to the building's door. Nothing else. No people. The noise from the fireworks was still loud out here, but the crowd sounds were muffled, and in the gap between 2 back-to-back bursts I heard, from somewhere to the north of the park, a sound I'd spent enough time around to identify without thinking about it. Not one shot this time, multiple. 3 in quick succession, then a pause, then what sounded like 2 more from a different direction or a different weapon, harder to tell. Then screaming, faint, from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint through the firework noise. Then more fireworks covering it again. Lily said, "Owen." "Yeah," I said. "I know." "What is that?" "I don't know yet." I took out the radio and scanned up from the emergency aux frequency I'd heard earlier. 30 seconds of scanning. I found it again. Different speaker this time. Same channel. Still partial, but clearer now, because we were slightly removed from the crowd noise. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach infected subjects. Seeking assistance at the north. I say again, do not approach infected subjects. I stopped scanning. Lily was watching my face. She said, "What?" I said, "We're leaving the park." She said, "Through the service area?" "Through the service area, and then straight to the truck." "What did you hear?" I told her while we moved. She didn't argue. She didn't stop to ask follow-up questions or reconsider. She pulled her sandals tighter across the strap in the back and matched my pace, which was fast, but not running, because running before you know what you're running from is one of the better ways to make a situation worse. We went down the service lane, hooked right behind the storage building, found another access gate in the east perimeter fence that was padlocked, but where the fence post had just enough give that I could work the bottom rail up about 18 inches. I said, "Go," and Lily went through on her belly without complaining about the gravel, and then we were on the utility easement, running alongside the park's eastern tree line. My truck was parked in the overflow lot on Ridgemont Avenue, quarter-mile from where we were. We walked it. Fast, but walked it. Around us, the fireworks were still going. Behind us, the crowd noise was an undifferentiated mass of sound, and I was trying to sort it. The way you learn to sort audio traffic in a busy signal environment, trying to find the threads that didn't belong. I could hear the crowd. I could hear a vendor's generator somewhere on the park's west side. I could hear someone on a phone behind us, not panicking yet, just saying hello, hello, in that mildly frustrated way that means the call keeps dropping. I could not hear, at this distance, whatever was happening at the north end of the park, and I took that as information. We reached the overflow lot. My truck, a 2014 Silverado, gray, high mileage, reliable, was where I'd left it near the back fence. I unlocked it. Lily got in. I started it. I said, "Seatbelt." She gave me a look that meant she was already putting it on. I pulled out of the lot and went north on Ridgemont Avenue for about 2 blocks before I caught the first sign that things were going sideways faster than I'd calculated. There were 3 cop cars parked across the intersection of Ridgemont and Pierce, lights going, and they weren't positioned the way cops position for a routine traffic thing. They were blocking the intersection, pushed in at angles. One of them had the driver's door hanging open and nobody in it. The 2 other cars had officers standing outside them with their hands up in that particular stance. Bent slightly at the knees, one hand at the holster. That means they're deciding whether to draw. From inside the truck, I couldn't see what they were looking at. I didn't try to find out. I turned west on Orchard before I hit the intersection. Lily said, "Are those cops?" "Yes." "What are they doing?" "I don't know from here. I'm not going closer." "Owen, we need to get to the shop. I need the gear in the shop." "What gear?" "Emergency kit, radios, maps. I'll explain while we drive." She looked out the passenger window as we went past the corner of Orchard and 2nd, and I saw her go still, in a way that meant she was processing something, and I didn't look because I was watching the road. I found out later what she'd seen. There was a man in the parking lot of the Walgreens on the corner who was down on his hands and knees over something on the ground, and the something on the ground was another person, and what was happening between them was not something she described in detail then or later. We drove to my shop. The shop is, I still think of it in present tense even though I haven't been back in weeks, a rented commercial space on Halcott Industrial, about 3 miles from the park. I do contract radio work, antenna installations, comms equipment repair for small businesses and farms out in the county. I had a lease on 800 square feet that included a back room with a workbench and enough shelf space for the stockpile I'm about to describe. I should tell you about that stockpile, because it's relevant and because I'm not embarrassed about it, even though the word for people who keep that kind of stockpile is a word that comes with certain associations I've never fully agreed with. I kept a go bag and a larger gear cache because I'd spent 6 years working in environments where communications infrastructure fails at the worst possible time, and I'd internalized the habit of having backup systems for everything. The gear in that shop wasn't survival paranoia. It was professional overcaution expressed in physical objects. What was in the shop when we got there? 2 portable radio transceivers, Yaesu FT60R handhelds, plus a mobile VHF-UHF unit that could be run off vehicle power or a battery. A laptop with offline maps covering a 200-mile radius downloaded to its drive. A hand-crank shortwave receiver. 300 feet of coax cable in varying lengths and connectors. 3 deep-cycle marine batteries on a battery tender, plus the portable solar charging kit that went with them. A first aid kit I'd put together myself over 2 years, not a gas station kit, a real one, with suture material and quick clot and a tourniquet, and several things Lily looked at with a specific expression when she went through it later. 4 days of food in a plastic bin, canned goods, protein bars, packets of instant coffee, a hand pump water filter, maps, real paper topographic maps, USKIs, for the county and the 4 counties around it, 2 headlamps, extra batteries, paracord, duct tape, a folding knife, a fixed blade Mora, and a machete I mostly used for clearing antenna access paths. A 12-gauge Mossberg 590 and 4 boxes of shells, which I had a license for, and kept for exactly the reason you keep a shotgun if you spend time alone in rural areas. I also had a notebook in the top drawer of the workbench with frequencies, specific frequencies, local emergency services, county coordinating channels, state emergency management networks, the national emergency comms frequencies, plus a whole secondary sheet of amateur radio repeater outputs for the region. 6 years in Signal Corps, you end up knowing which frequencies actually matter and which are just for looking official. We got to the shop at 22 minutes after the first firework went up. I unlocked the front door, sent Lily to load the food bin into the truck, and started pulling radio gear off the shelf. While I worked, I had the handheld radio going, scanning, and the picture it painted in the 12 minutes we were in the shop was not ambiguous. The county emergency net was saturated, meaning the channel was live, and multiple units were transmitting simultaneously, in a way that created constant crosstalk and interference, which in radio terms means the system is at capacity, because too many people are trying to use it at once, which means something large-scale is happening. I caught pieces of it. Descriptions of individuals exhibiting violent behavior, multiple casualty reports, requests for medical units that weren't being acknowledged, a dispatcher trying to impose order on a net that had already lost it. I heard one transmission, clearer than the others, from what sounded like a county fire unit. We have a code blue at Ridgemont Park. I say again, code blue at Ridgemont. Large number of, and then a different voice cut over the top of it, and I lost the rest. Code blue means mass casualty event. Lily came back in from the truck and looked at my face and said, "How bad?" I said, "Unknown. I can hear emergency services on the county net, and it's saturated, which means multiple simultaneous incidents. I heard at least one mass casualty declaration from the park." She said, "How do we find out how bad?" I said, "We get somewhere high and we listen. There's a fire lookout tower in the forestry land east of town that I've been to before for antenna work. It's on a ridge, high enough for decent propagation radius, isolated access road, defensible position if that's what it comes to." She said, "You've thought about this before." I said, "I've thought about a lot of things." I loaded the last of the radio gear into a hard case and zipped it. I grabbed the Mossberg and the shells. I went through the shop one more time, got the battery tender unhooked from the marine batteries, and loaded all 3 of them with a hand truck into the truck bed, even though one of them probably had less than half a charge. I got the solar panel kit. I got the coax cable. I got the topographic maps and the notebook with the frequencies. Lily came to the shop's back window and said, "Owen, come look at this." I went to the window. Halcott Industrial was a quiet street. 3 or 4 businesses, loading docks, a plumbing supply warehouse at the far end. At this hour on a Saturday it would normally be empty. It wasn't. There were 2 cars that had clearly been in an accident, fender to fender in the middle of the road, both with doors open. 2 people were walking up the center of the street, coming from the direction of town. Their gait was wrong. Not wrong in a way I could immediately name, just wrong. The way you know when something is wrong before you can articulate what specifically is different. Too slow, too deliberate, heads slightly down. One of them turned toward the shop's front windows, and even from 30 feet I could see what I'd describe, clinically, as the absence of the thing that makes a face a face. The eye contact, or what looked like eye contact, without any of the micro-muscle response that normally happens when a person makes eye contact with another person. No curiosity, no recognition, nothing. I said, "Get in the truck." We got in the truck. I drove out the back of the property through a loading dock lane that came out on Thurston Way, which ran parallel to Halcott and was empty. We went east on Thurston, hit Route 9 at the edge of town, and I turned east on Route 9 and didn't stop. The access road to Hammond Ridge was 6 miles east of the Route 9 junction with County Road 14. I'd been up it twice before. Once to check a repeater antenna that a local amateur radio club had mounted to the tower structure in some informal arrangement with the Forestry Service, and once, just because I was curious about the propagation characteristics of the ridge and wanted to take a few readings. The road was unpaved past the first mile, single lane, climbing about 800 feet of elevation to the ridgetop where the tower sat. In July, dry, it was manageable in a pickup with decent tires. In November, it would be impassable without serious equipment. We got to the tower at around 11:30 that night. Full dark. The fireworks would have been done for an hour at that point, and whatever was happening in Ridgemont was happening without us. I'm not going to tell you that leaving felt easy. It didn't. There were 40,000 people at that park. Some number of them were dying while we drove east. I spent the drive telling myself that we had no medical capability, no defensive capability, no means of affecting anything happening at that park, that driving back into it would accomplish nothing except adding 2 more people to the casualty count. I believe that analysis was correct. I also know that believing something correct doesn't stop it from sitting in your chest like a coal. Lily didn't say anything for the first 20 minutes of the drive. She had her phone out and was scrolling through social media and news apps, and I could tell from the way her breathing changed periodically that she was finding things. Around the time we turned onto County Road 14, she said, "I'm seeing video from the park, from people's phones." I said, "What's in the videos?" She said, "People running, people down on the ground. I can see things happening to the people on the ground that I don't know how to describe it." I said, "Is there any official information?" She scrolled. "Emergency alert on my phone says, violent incidents reported in Ridgemont area. Avoid public gatherings. Await further instructions." That's all. That's all. The county sheriff's Facebook has a post from 2 hours ago that says, "Law enforcement is responding to reports of violent individuals in multiple locations," and nothing since. She looked up from the phone. "Owen, what is this?" I said, "I heard the word infected on an emergency services channel at the park. I don't know more than that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Infected with what?" "I genuinely don't know." She looked back at her phone, and I drove, and neither of us said anything else until we reached the Tower Road. Setting up the tower as a livable space took most of that first night and all of the next morning. I'm not going to compress it into one line because the work matters. Understanding the work helps you understand how we survived the first weeks, and understanding how we survived the first weeks is the whole point of why I'm telling this. The tower cab had been cleared of all the actual firefighting observation equipment at some point. The Aladad was gone, the logbooks were gone, the communication equipment was gone. What remained was the structure itself, the glass and screen windows on all 4 sides, the trap door in the floor that opened above the ladder, a built-in shelf on the north wall, and the general structural soundness of a building that had been maintained as a matter of liability by the Forestry Service. The ladder running up the outside of the steel leg structure was bolted to the legs and secured. The trapdoor had a hook and eye latch on the inside. I ran the power setup first. Marine battery into the mobile radio transceiver, temporary antenna run, about 15 feet of coax out through the northwest window to a simple vertical eye clamp to the railing. That got me something workable for local traffic. I left the radio scanning the county emergency nets and the amateur radio bands while I worked on the physical setup, and I listened to the shape of the night through the speaker while I moved things up the ladder. What the radio told me between midnight and 6 in the morning. The emergency management net was still saturated at midnight and started to thin by 2 a.m., which is not a good sign. A thinning emergency net in an active incident usually means one of two things. The situation has been brought under control, or the people running the net have been removed from the picture. By 2 a.m., there was no way the situation in Ridgemont had been brought under control. I'd seen enough from the road and the shop to know that. So the thinning meant the net was losing its operators. And the operators were the dispatchers and the coordination people, and if they were going offline, it meant the county EOC was in trouble. By 3 a.m., I was picking up amateur radio traffic on the 2-meter and 70-centimeter bands. Ham operators check in during emergencies. It's part of the culture. There's an established emergency protocol called ARES that coordinates amateur radio resources for exactly these situations. And hams are often more useful than official channels during large-scale events because they're distributed and self-sufficient. The traffic I was hearing was amateur operators talking to each other, pooling information, and what I was hearing was a map of the outbreak spreading in real time, not just Ridgemont. By 3:15, I was hearing about incidents in 3 different towns within a 30-mile radius. By 4 a.m., someone on the repeater net was reporting that the hospital in Ridgemont had been overrun. His word, overrun, by people exhibiting the violent behavior. By 5 a.m., most of the amateur radio operators who'd been active had gone off the air, either because they'd had to relocate or because something had happened to them that prevented further transmission. By dawn, I knew that whatever this was, it was not a contained incident. It was not a riot. It was not a gas leak or a chemical spill or a terror attack in any conventional sense. It was something spreading through the population, and it was spreading faster than any institution was prepared to handle. I told Lily at dawn. She'd slept for about 2 hours on the rollout mat I'd brought up, and then lay awake, listening to the radio traffic, the way you lie awake, listening to rain, when you're not sure if it's going to flood. I sat down next to her and told her what the radio picture looked like, and she listened with her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms around them, and she looked about 12 years old for a few minutes, which is not what she actually looks like, but it's what stress does to people's faces sometimes. When I finished, she said, "What do we do?" I said, "We stay here until I understand the scope of it better. We have supplies for about 4 days. I need to know what's in between us and anywhere else before we move, and I need more radio intel to build that picture. So we stay here and we listen." She said, "What if someone comes up the road? Someone friendly or someone not?" "Either," I said. "We have the high ground and a limited access point. If someone comes up the road and they look right, I'll talk to them. If they don't look right, we have time to observe before they reach us." She thought about this. She said, "And we keep listening. We keep listening." That was the plan. It was the right plan for day 1 and day 2. What I didn't account for was that the plan was going to change. And it was going to change because a white Subaru Outback with a cracked rear bumper and a National Public Radio sticker on the back window was going to come up my access road on day 3 at about 11 in the morning. And inside it was going to be a 58-year-old retired electrician named Pete Holloway, with a bloody bandage on his forearm that turned out, after Lily examined it carefully, with the kind of controlled professionalism she would not have had a year ago, but probably has because of her clinical coursework, to be a laceration from broken glass rather than a bite wound. Pete had a lot to tell us. He'd been at his house in Ridgemont when things went bad. He lived about 6 blocks from the park, and he'd spent 2 days hiding in his attic before the street below cleared enough for him to get to his car. He'd tried to drive west out of Ridgemont and found the westbound roads blocked, not by official blockades, but by abandoned cars and by the kinds of conditions that make you not want to keep driving west. So he'd gone east on Route 9, and he'd been going east and pulling off when necessary for a day and a half, sleeping in the car, and he'd seen the forestry road sign for Hammond Ridge and remembered hearing something about a fire lookout tower up there, and he'd thought high ground sounded correct. He was a big man, Pete, broad through the chest, gray beard, the specific kind of permanence that some people have that makes them seem like they grew directly out of whatever county they're from. He'd worked 30 years as an industrial electrician, and he'd retired 2 years ago. And he'd spent those 2 years making things in his garage workshop, and he had a car full of tools, because he'd grabbed what mattered to him when he left the house. I let him in. I want to be clear about my thinking, because this is a decision I've second-guessed and re-examined and settled on as correct, probably, though probably is doing a lot of work in that sentence. I let him in because he'd come to a visible destination that wasn't obvious from the road unless you knew what you were looking for, which suggested someone with enough awareness to navigate. He was alone. His injury was verifiably not a bite wound, and he was honest about what he'd seen and where he'd been in a way that had a lot of specific, accurate detail about Ridgemont's geography that you'd have to know to invent. If you're going to build any kind of sustainable position with a population greater than 2, you need people who have skills you don't, and an industrial electrician is not a useless addition to a group where the generator situation is going to become critical. Lily cleaned his arm and taped it up, and told him it was going to scar, and he said he'd survived uglier, and that was the beginning of their friendship. That first night with Pete, I explained the radio picture as I understood it. He listened and asked good questions, not panicked questions, practical ones. How wide? How fast? Any indication of cause? Any official information worth trusting? I answered each one with what I knew and what I was still trying to find out, and I appreciated that he didn't try to fill in the gaps with theory. He just sat with the uncertainty, the way an experienced tradesman sits with a problem he doesn't have enough information to solve yet. At the end, he said, "The power grid's going to start going down soon." I said, "I know." He said, "I've got enough of my tools to keep a small generator running for a good while if we can get fuel. I can also rig a better solar setup than what you've got if you have the parts." I said, "What I've got might not be enough long term." He said, "I figured. I can work with what you have and add to it." We talked until almost midnight. At one point during a lull in the conversation, I noticed Lily was at the south window with the binoculars I'd brought, looking down into the darkened valley below, and I watched her for a moment and thought about what 6 weeks ago looked like from this specific moment, and it didn't help anything, so I stopped doing it. Day 5. Nora Falk arrived on a bicycle. A bicycle. From Ridgemont. With a backpack and a pair of scrubs still on because she'd been at the hospital when things went bad, and she'd had exactly enough time to realize the hospital was lost, grab what medications she could stuff in a pack, and get on a bike in the parking lot. She'd been moving at night and hiding during the day. She had about 11 miles of terrain under her belt, and she was the most focused person I'd talked to in a week when she got to the tower. She was 31. Short, red hair cut to just below her ears. Forearms that suggested she spent time at the gym or had very physical habits. A habit of stating her exact qualifications when she introduced herself, to avoid any ambiguity about what she could and couldn't do medically. "I'm an ER nurse. 4 years. Trauma and critical care. I'm not a doctor. I can do a lot of things, but there's a list of things I can't, and I'll tell you which is which." She sat down and drank about a liter of water from our supply, and then said, "What do you know?" in a way that meant she was ready to compare notes. She told us what she'd seen at the hospital, which I won't describe in full, because it's exactly what you'd imagine, and imagination is enough for this. What mattered from what she told us was a detail that I'd been trying to determine from the radio and hadn't been able to confirm: the timeline, from bite to change. She'd observed it multiple times in an emergency room setting, and she was specific. Fast cases, 3 to 4 hours. Average, 5 to 6. Longest she'd personally witnessed before she'd had to leave, 8 hours. She had a working theory about why it varied: body mass, circulatory response, probably location of the bite, but she was clear it was a theory. She also told us that the bite wound itself wasn't the only transmission vector, she thought. She was careful to say she thought, because she was careful about the difference between what she'd observed and what she was extrapolating. But she'd seen 2 cases that came in with no bite wounds and presented the same course, and in both cases, There was a shared contact with fluids from an infected individual, which was, she said, consistent with how certain other infectious processes worked and shouldn't be ruled out. I wrote all of this in the radio log notebook, in the section I'd started labeling operational notes. By day 5, we were 3 people in the tower cab, and Pete was sleeping in the truck. That wasn't sustainable spatially or logistically. The Forestry Service equipment shed and the ranger cabin at the base of the tower, structures I hadn't really assessed as livable spaces initially, became the subject of a half-day conversation about how to use them. What came out of that conversation was this. The tower cab remained mine, primarily, as an observation and radio post. The ranger cabin, which had a wood stove, 2 bunk frames, a bathroom with no running water, but a toilet that would function without pressure if we managed it right, became living quarters for Pete and Nora. The equipment shed had a concrete floor, no insulation, but a solid roll-down door and enough interior space to stage supplies and give us a work area that wasn't 14 by 14 feet, 60 feet in the air. Lily stayed in the tower with me. She didn't propose this explicitly. She just started sleeping up there and stopped mentioning moving to the cabin, and I didn't raise the subject. Day 9, Darren Coyle. I heard him on an amateur radio frequency before I saw him. He was using a handheld, and his signal kept cutting in and out, which meant he was moving through terrain, and I was getting him between hilltops. He was transmitting on a standard simplex frequency, calling for anyone in the area. I responded, and we talked for about 20 minutes of broken audio over the next 2 hours, while he worked his way closer. I established that he was alone, that he was a forestry worker who knew this specific chunk of land well, and that he'd spent the last week moving through the backcountry on foot, which explained why he was alive. He was 27, taller than Pete by several inches, the kind of lean that comes from actual outdoor physical work rather than exercise. He had a USF's issue radio and a handheld GPS, and a pack that weighed, by his estimate, about 65 pounds, because he'd stopped at a wilderness supply cache that the Forestry Service kept at 2 points in his patrol area. He knew the terrain within about 20 miles of the tower, in the specific, practical way that people who spend their working lives in it know it. Not just what's where, but what the access conditions are in what season, where the water sources are, where the old logging roads go, where the old mine workings were that the agency kept flagged on their internal maps. He was worth more than I can explain in terms of what he added to our situation. He was also, I discovered in the first 24 hours, the kind of person who didn't talk much, and when he did, said exactly what he meant, which is a quality I find easier to be around than most others. He looked at the tower setup. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the equipment shed. He asked about our water situation and our food situation and our radio capability. And then he said, I know where there's a Forestry Service supply cache about 6 miles northeast of here that has fuel, hand tools, and basic food stores. I can get there and back in a day if someone wants to come. I said I'd come. We went the next morning. I won't turn it into a long account because the trip itself was uneventful in most ways. 6 miles of mixed terrain, 1 creek crossing, no infected encountered, though we moved cautiously through every area of limited sightlines. The cache was in a lockbox, built into a concrete pad, at the edge of an old logging spur road. Darren had a key from his Forestry Service credentials. Inside, 20-gallon jerry cans of stabilized gasoline, hand tools including saws and a splitting maul, 2 cases of emergency food packets, first aid supplies, a tarp and some line, and a USFS-issued radio in its charging cradle, connected to a small solar panel array that was still functioning. That USFS radio was significant. It ran on a different set of frequencies than my amateur gear, the Forestry Service VHF frequencies, which included some bands I could listen to but not transmit on with my current setup. Having it meant access to more of the radio picture. I brought it back and added it to the listening rotation. Here's what I was building in those first 2 weeks. A picture. Not of what to do, that was still evolving, but of what the situation actually looked like across the region. Radio is how you understand the shape of a catastrophe from a fixed point. You can't go everywhere. You can listen to everyone who's transmitting from everywhere, And from that, you can triangulate a rough map of where things are bad and where they're worse. What the radio told me over the first 2 weeks, cumulatively, the outbreak had hit every urban center in the state within the first 48 hours. Every one of them, not evenly. Some were hit hard and fast, some took longer, which suggested either multiple introduction points or a pattern to how the infection spread geographically. Rural areas were hit later, but, from the transmissions I was monitoring, hit eventually. There were pockets of apparent stability, communities that had locked down fast enough, or been far enough from the initial spread, to remain relatively intact. But they were islands, and the water around them was rising. Government communications, the official channels, emergency management frequencies, FAMA nets, went progressively quieter through the first week, and were, by the end of the second week, almost silent. Not completely silent, but what remained was sparse, and increasingly, strange. The strange part is what I need to describe carefully, because it's the thing that changed everything, and I want to get it right. Around the middle of week 2, I started picking up a broadcast. Not a two-way transmission, a broadcast, meaning someone transmitting continuously or near continuously, not listening, just sending. It was on a frequency in the upper HF range, around 7 megahertz, which is a shortwave band. The content of the broadcast was a loop, the same message repeating every 40 minutes. A voice, calm, female, clearly recorded, and being retransmitted rather than live. Reading something that sounded like official emergency information. Direction to a rescue collection point. An address in Ridgemont. Specifically, Ridgemont County Fairgrounds. Promises of food, medical care, organized transport to a secured federal facility. A date, July 31st. The message said, the rescue operation would begin on July 31st, and that all survivors in the region should converge on the fairgrounds. I listened to this loop 6 times before I said anything to the others. What bothered me about it, the address. The Ridgemont County Fairgrounds is a large, flat, open space on the south end of town with 3 main structures: the exhibition hall, the livestock pavilion, and a smaller office building. There is nothing defensively useful about it. If you wanted to collect survivors and keep them safe, you would not choose an open fairground in the middle of a town with an active outbreak. You would choose something with walls, elevation, limited access points. The fairground is surrounded by a low decorative fence and parking lots. It is the last place a person with any security awareness would designate as a rescue collection point. The date also bothered me. July 31st was 19 days from the broadcast's apparent start date. 19 days is a long time to keep survivors stationary in unstable conditions. A genuine rescue operation would be pulling people out as fast as possible, not telling them to sit tight for 3 weeks. I started researching the frequency. With the shortwave receiver and my technical background, I could get a rough sense of the broadcast's origin location, based on propagation characteristics and signal strength patterns. It was coming from somewhere relatively close, within about a 50-mile radius, and it was transmitting with more power than a handheld or a portable unit could produce. It was a fixed location, high-power installation. I shared all of this with the group at our second week dinner. We'd developed a dinner table habit by this point, all 5 of us eating together in the equipment shed at the large folding table Pete had found in the cabin's storage room. Because eating together in a small group when everything else is fragmented is one of those things that matters more than it sounds like it should. I laid out what I was seeing and what I thought it meant. Pete listened and then said, "You think someone's running a trap?" I said, "I think it's possible. The details of the broadcast are wrong in specific ways that suggest either incompetence or intent." Nora said, "Who would benefit from driving survivors to an open, indefensible location?" I said, "Someone who wants survivors concentrated and predictable." Darren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Or something is happening that the people running the rescue operation didn't plan well enough. Not everything that looks wrong is intentional. Sometimes it's just government agencies not knowing what they're doing." I said, "That's also possible." He said, "How do you find out which?" I said, "More listening, and maybe a different antenna setup." Russell Embry told me something different, but I'll get to Russell. Russell came on day 17. He was the last person to join our group before things changed. He drove up the access road in a beat-up camper van that had enough antenna hardware strapped to its roof that I spotted it through the binoculars a mile down the road and thought, initially, that he might be some kind of broadcast relay vehicle, which would have been interesting in a very specific way. He was 44, stocky, with the particular energy of someone who has spent a lot of time alone with electronics and is compensating socially for it. He'd been an amateur radio operator for 22 years. He had a call sign, KD7RXM, which is a perfectly ordinary amateur radio identifier, but which he told me within the first 10 minutes, with the specific pride of someone who considers it a name. He had excellent gear, better than mine in some respects. He had a 100-watt mobile HF transceiver in the van with a multiband antenna that gave him shortwave range I couldn't match with my portable setup. He also had 2 weeks of food in the van and a small inverter generator and about 30 gallons of gasoline in approved containers. He was useful. He was also, I want to say this carefully, because I'd like to be fair to the complexity of it, he was also a person with an inner life that I didn't fully understand until things got difficult. Not a bad person. I still don't think of him as a bad person. But there were things about Russell that mattered later, and I'm trying to be accurate. He'd heard the rescue broadcast. He'd heard it before I had, because his HF setup was running from day 3 of the outbreak. He had an entire notebook of logged transmissions. He sat down with my notebook and his notebook at the equipment shed table 2 days after he arrived, and we went through both of them together. And the picture that emerged from combining his log with mine was more detailed and also more troubling. There had been earlier broadcasts. Before the July 31st rescue message, there had been broadcasts on the same frequency with different content, shorter, not looping, more conversational in character, as if someone was testing transmission capability. Russell had caught 3 of them. The first was 2 days after the outbreak started. He played it back from a recording he'd made on his phone held up to the speaker. The audio was rough but audible. A male voice, this one, saying, "Transmission check on this frequency. Checking propagation to the east. Please acknowledge if receiving." Then a pause. Then the same voice. "Acknowledged. Signal is good. Begin coordination on schedule." That was it. That was the whole transmission. I listened to it twice. I asked Russell who he thought it was. He said, "Someone with a professional installation and a pre-arranged communication partner." I said, "And 2 days after the outbreak started, they're doing transmission checks and coordinating a schedule." He said, "Right." I said, "That's not emergency management scrambling to organize a response. That's something that was already in place." He looked at me and said, "That's what I thought too." I wrote it down. Here's the thing about Russell that mattered later. He'd been in contact with another group before he came to us. Not from the tower. He'd talked to them from his van while he was still moving around the county, in the days before he found his way up the access road. A group of about a dozen people who'd set up in a former National Guard armory building about 22 miles west of us, near the town of Kettner. He'd told me about this group when he arrived. It was why he knew about us, because someone in that group had mentioned hearing a signal from the Hammond Ridge direction that suggested an HF station, and he'd come to investigate. He described them as well-organized, well-armed, and operating under a guy he referred to as Todd, which was his name, Todd Page. Todd, Russell told me, was 40-ish, a former Army Reserve sergeant, very capable, very organized, running a tight operation, had maybe 60 people under his roof, including several families. They had generators, water, medical capability, a food store. I asked Russell why he'd left them if they were so well set up. Russell said, "I didn't leave them. I'm still in contact with them." I didn't say anything right away. He said, "I thought both groups knowing about each other was good. More information, more coordination. That's how networks work, right? More nodes, better coverage." I said, "How much do they know about us?" He said, "Just the basics, high ground, observation tower, radio capability." I said, "Did you tell them the location?" He paused. I told them it was east on Route 9, general area. I nodded slowly. I said, Okay, and I moved the conversation forward, because there were other things to discuss. But I put a mark on the page in my head next to Russell's name, and I left it there. I need to talk about Lily here, because I've been moving through logistics and radio analysis, and I haven't talked about her enough. And she's the reason I was at the park in the first place. And she's the reason some of the things that happened next hurt as much as they did. Around week 3, she started getting headaches. She mentioned it twice in an offhand way. Morning headaches, the kind that cleared with coffee or water. I attributed it to the change in sleep conditions, the stress, the altitude difference. We were at elevation in a dry summer, and she was probably chronically slightly dehydrated. I told her to drink more water. On day 22, she had a low fever. I know the number, 99.4, because Nora checked it with a thermometer from the med kit and told me the number, and I wrote it in the log. Nora came to me privately that evening, after Lily was in the sleeping bag on her side of the tower cab. She stood at the railing on the south side of the catwalk with me, and she said, in the careful voice that means someone is trying to be accurate rather than alarming, "I want to flag something. The fever is probably nothing, probably stress response or something environmental. But I'd like to ask you something and I need you to answer accurately." I said, "Ask it." She said, "At any point during the escape from the park, the crowds, the gate, any of it, is there any chance Lily was in contact with someone who was already symptomatic? Close contact, brush contact, anything?" I thought about it carefully. I thought about the gate. We'd moved through it without contact. The crowd before the gate, we'd been at the perimeter, not deep in it. The parking lot, nothing that jumped out. I said, nothing I observed. But I was focused on movement and route and not on monitoring contact. Nora said, "I want to keep an eye on it." I said, "You think?" She said, "I think probably not. The incubation timeline is inconsistent with symptoms starting this late. Every case I observed went symptomatic within 8 hours. She's been fine for 22 days. That's outside any range I saw, so probably no, but I want to watch it." I said, "Okay." She said, "Don't scare her." I said, "I know." I didn't sleep much that night. I watched Lily breathing in the dark, and I listened to the radio on low volume, and I calculated incubation rates, and told myself Nora was right. Too late. Outside the range. Probably just stress. Probably the altitude and the sleep deprivation, and the protein-deficient diet we'd been on. I told myself this for 2 days, and then on day 24, the fever broke on its own and didn't come back, and Lily said she felt fine, and I almost believed everything was fine and then didn't quite get there. Let me tell you about the discovery that changed everything, because I need to get to it, and I've been circling it. Day 26. I'd been building a clearer picture of the rescue broadcast, the one directing survivors to the Ridgemont County Fairgrounds for July 31st. I'd triangulated the signal origin as best I could with the gear I had. The source was somewhere within roughly a 20-mile arc to my southwest. Within that arc there were several possibilities, but one stood out on the USCIS topo maps, a communications installation on a hilltop about 14 miles southwest, formerly designated as Federal Relay Station Carver. It appeared on some of the older county maps as Fort Carver, a name left over from when the land was a military post in the early 20th century. The current installation was a federal telecommunications relay, the kind of infrastructure that routes government communications through the region. High ground, high power antennas, hardened building, probably with backup power systems designed for extended operation. If someone wanted to run a high-power HF broadcast indefinitely from a secure location, with reliable power, Relay Station Carver was exactly the kind of place you'd use. The question was who? I was working through this at the radio desk. 2 marine batteries now wired in parallel, radio units lined up, the antenna coax running out the north window to the better directional antenna Darren and I had jury-rigged from components. When Russell came up the ladder without me hearing him coming, which he sometimes did, and sat down in the folding chair by the south window, and after a few minutes of silence he said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Todd's group heard the rescue broadcast, the fairgrounds one. They're going to the fairgrounds on July 31st. I said, "That's in 5 days." He said, "Yes." I said, Did you tell them what I've been saying about the broadcast? He was quiet for a moment. I turned around and looked at him. He said, I told Todd that you had concerns about the broadcast. Yes. And he thinks your concerns are theoretical. He thinks you're reading too much into radio analysis. He says his people need medical resources and organized support, and the broadcast is the best shot they've got. I said, did you tell him the specific technical reasons I think the broadcast is wrong? Russell said, I told him the general version. There's a gap between general version and specific technical reasons that matters here. I know that, he said. It came out flat, a little defensive. He's got 60 people, Owen. Families, kids. He can't keep them in that building on theoretical radio analysis. He needs something concrete. I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, how long have you been giving Todd information about this group? He didn't answer right away. I said, not how long have you been talking to him? How long have you been giving him specific information about our location, our capabilities, our supplies? Russell put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. He said, I thought it was coordination. I still think. How long? Since I got here, I told him the day I arrived that I'd found a viable group with radio capability, and I gave him the location. I sat with that for a moment. The weight of what it meant fanned out in multiple directions. Todd's group knew exactly where we were. They knew our radio capability. They probably knew our head count. If Todd was planning to move 60 people to the fairgrounds and things went wrong there, which I believed they would, he might decide before that 60 people plus our supplies and our tower was a better outcome than 60 people at an open fairground. I said, has Todd talked about coming here? Russell said, not specifically. What's the non-specific version? He exhaled. He mentioned that if the fairground situation didn't pan out, having a second option would be good. He knows this place is defensible. He knows we have radio equipment he doesn't. I said, so we have two problems. One is 60 people about to walk into what I believe is a trap at the fairgrounds. The other is a group leader who knows where we are and might decide we're useful to him in a way we haven't agreed to. Russell said, Todd isn't. I said, I'm not saying Todd is a villain. I'm saying 60 people in a desperate situation, with a leader who knows about a resource they need, is a dynamic that has a predictable direction. Russell was quiet. I said, go get the others. We need to talk. That conversation took most of an evening, and it covered ground that was uncomfortable in the specific way that conversations are uncomfortable when they involve things you've been avoiding saying to people you've been living with closely for almost a month. Pete sat with his arms crossed and listened, and asked one or two very direct questions, and that was Pete. Nora listened and made notes on a pad she carried, which was Nora. Darren sat at the far end of the table and watched the door, and didn't say much, which I'd come to understand was how he processed. The silence wasn't absence, it was work. Russell told the full version of his Todd communications, which I mostly already knew, but hearing it laid out sequentially made it clearer. There was more than I'd guessed. Daily check-ins, in some cases. He'd been reporting our situation to Todd's group with a regularity that suggested it wasn't casual. Nobody got angry at Russell in a way I'd call unfair. He'd genuinely thought coordination was correct. He'd believed it was helping. The problem is that coordination without consent from the people being coordinated about is just surveillance. The decision we reached that night, I would try to contact Todd directly, through Russell, and I would attempt to make the case against the fairgrounds, not the version Russell had given him, the full technical case, numbers and frequencies and antenna analysis and all of it. If Todd could be persuaded, 60 people wouldn't walk into a situation I believed was dangerous. If he couldn't be persuaded, at least I'd know. The secondary decision. We needed to verify what was actually happening at Relay Station Carver. Not from here, in person. Because the radio analysis gave me a probable origin point and a set of technical observations that were suggestive, but they didn't tell me who was running that broadcast or why, and I needed to know who before I could understand what we were up against. The third decision, which Lily made without being asked, she was coming on the Carver run. I said no. She said, I'm the only other person here besides you. with enough medical training to handle a situation that goes wrong on the road. I said, Nora. Nora needs to stay here in case something happens at the tower. You know that's right. I said, you're not field trained. She said, I know. I also know that you've spent 3 weeks teaching me everything I needed to know about moving through terrain with infected present. I'm not untrained anymore. This was accurate. I had been teaching her. Not because I planned to bring her on a mission, but because I believed everyone who was going to survive this needed the same basic operational knowledge, and Lily was smart enough to absorb it faster than I'd expected. I looked at her. She looked back. I said, you follow my lead on everything. She said, yes. I said, the moment I say we abort, we abort. Yes. No argument. I will argue. I just won't act against your call. That was the most honest thing she could have said, and I appreciated it. Darren came with us. It was his terrain, and his judgment about how to move through it was better than mine from a land navigation standpoint. The 3 of us left before dawn on day 28 in my truck, with radio gear and the shotgun and Darren's sidearm. 357 revolver he'd had in his pack since day 1, and which he'd demonstrated with sufficient accuracy on an informal range session that I wasn't going to question it, and a backpack with 2 days of supplies. We took Route 9 west until the Carver Road Junction, which appeared on the county map as a maintenance access road to the relay station. In the early pre-dawn dark, with the truck lights off for the last 2 miles on Darren's navigation instructions, we moved slowly, and I want to tell you about the world we moved through, because it was different from anything I'd experienced in the weeks before. The small towns along Route 9, Belmer, Cross Creek, the hamlet of Owens Landing, which I mention only because the coincidence of the name struck me, were silent, not empty, silent. You could see, from the road, shapes in the windows of some buildings. Not all of them. Most were just dark structures, ordinary buildings rendered strange by the absence of anyone who should be in them at 7 in the morning. But some had movement. The infected don't sleep the way we sleep. They're not nocturnal or diurnal in any organized sense. They're motion reactive. They stand or move without apparent pattern until something cues them, and in the dark, with our lights off and the truck moving slowly, with its engine at idle, we moved through those towns like ghosts passing through rooms they used to live in. There was a gas station on the edge of Cross Creek that I noted carefully. I needed to note it because fuel was going to become a genuine constraint within 3 weeks. The station appeared intact, no obvious blockade. I made a note on the map. One moment on that drive that I haven't been able to shake. On the edge of Belmer there was a small house with a light on in the front window. An actual light, not a candle or a flashlight, but an interior light that meant someone in that house had power. Lily saw it the same time I did. Neither of us said anything. We drove past. I told myself we'd note it for later, and I know that's probably as much as we were going to do with it. Later was already full. The Carver Road Junction was marked with a Forestry Service sign that had been knocked over, lying in the brush. The road beyond it was paved, unusual for this kind of access, which told me the installation it served was genuinely federal infrastructure, not just a maintenance path. We pulled about 100 yards up it, and I parked behind a stand of cedars that hid the truck from Route 9. From here, on foot. Relay Station Carver sat on a ridgeline about a mile from where we parked. The walk to it was through second-growth timber, steep in the middle third, then flattening as we approached the ridgetop. Darren led. I followed. Lily was behind me, staying in my shadow the way I'd told her, and she did it without complaint. We moved slowly and stopped every 100 yards to listen, the way I'd been trained and the way I'd trained her, and the terrain was largely clear except for one moment, about 400 yards from the station, when Darren went completely still with his fist raised, and we all stopped. Ahead of us on the slope, maybe 60 feet off, something was moving through the underbrush, moving the way infected move. No route logic, no awareness of obstacles, just forward pressure into whatever's in the way. We stood absolutely still for 90 seconds. The shape moved northwest, and the sound of it faded. We waited 2 additional minutes and then continued. The relay station was a compound, a main building about the size of a small warehouse, metal-sided, with a cluster of antenna towers on the ridge behind it, some of them 40 or 50 feet tall, and the unmistakable look of an HF antenna array on the south-facing slope. A chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded the compound. The gate was closed. There was a vehicle inside, a gray government SUV, the kind with no distinctive markings, and a smaller pickup truck I didn't recognize. There were lights on inside. We went prone at the fence line, and I got the binoculars. There were people inside the main building. I could see through a window on the building's east face, a room with overhead fluorescent lights still running, meaning the station's generator was operational. I could see 2 people at a table, maybe 20 feet from the window, a third person moving in the background. I watched for 10 minutes. The 2 people at the table had papers or maps spread out between them. One of them had a radio handset, large, fixed station type, and periodically picked it up and appeared to speak into it and set it down. The third person, when they came into view, was looking at a laptop. Nothing about what I was watching looked like emergency management trying to help people. It looked like a small group of people who knew what they were doing, operating in a structured way, without the improvised quality of actual emergency response. I watched for another 5 minutes, and then tapped Darren's shoulder, and we backed out of the fence line the way we'd come. On the walk back down to the truck, I went through what I'd seen and what it meant. Lily asked questions quietly as we moved, the kind of careful, specific questions that told me her mind was already working through the same analysis. By the time we reached the truck, I had a version of it assembled that was as clear as I could make it with what I had. Someone was operating out of Relay Station Carver with personnel, generator power, and HF transmitting capability. They were broadcasting a rescue message that directed survivors to an indefensible open location, on a date still several days away. They were doing this in a structured, pre-planned way that had started within 48 hours of the outbreak. They had communication partners. The early transmission Russell had recorded said acknowledged, signal is good, begin coordination on schedule, meaning there were at least 2 nodes to this operation. The questions I couldn't answer: who were they? What did they want? And what happened to survivors who followed the broadcast to the fairgrounds? What I suspected and couldn't prove: someone had anticipated this outbreak. Not guessed at a possible future outbreak, actually anticipated this specific event, on approximately this timeline in this region. The prearranged coordination, the speed of activation, the professional operation within a secured government facility, all pointed toward prior knowledge. That was a thought I kept at arm's length, because it's the kind of thought that, if you let it run unchecked, leads you to places that aren't useful. I needed to know what was happening, not theorize about what it might mean in some larger sense. What I knew I needed to do: get inside that building and talk to whoever was in there, or get enough technical intelligence from the outside to figure out what they were transmitting and why. Neither option was something I could do with 3 people, inadequate equipment, and no plan in an afternoon. We drove back to the tower. I got Todd on the radio that night, through Russell's van, which had the range. It was not a comfortable conversation. Todd had a radio voice, confident, projecting, the kind of voice that commands rooms. He listened to my technical analysis of the rescue broadcast for about 3 minutes, and then said, "I hear what you're saying, and I'm not dismissing it, but what I've got is 60 people who need resources I can't provide here. The fairground message is the best information I have." I said, "The best information you have is demonstrably, technically inconsistent with a legitimate rescue operation. I've described why in detail." He said, "Or it's a government operation, set up quickly by people who aren't as operationally smart as you are. You're assigning intention to what might be incompetence." I said, "That's possible. I'm asking you not to bring 60 people to a specific location until we can verify whether it's competence, incompetence, or deliberate misdirection." He was quiet for a moment. I said, "Give me 48 hours. I'll go back to the relay station and get closer. If I can confirm the people operating it are genuinely emergency management, I'll tell you, and you can make the fairground run knowing the information is verified." He said, "The message says the 31st. That's 2 days from now." "Yes." "You want me to hold 60 people in place for 2 days on your theory?" I said, I want you to hold 60 people in place for 2 days, instead of sending them to an open fairground based on a radio broadcast that doesn't hold up technically. Another pause. I could hear the weight of 60 people in that pause. I understood it. I wasn't carrying 60 people. He was. That changes your relationship to risk. He said, 24 hours. You've got until the morning of the 31st. If I don't hear from you by 6 a.m. on the 31st, with something concrete, I'm moving my people. I said, 24 hours. And I want you to know I'm doing this because Russell told me you know what you're doing with radio, and I have reason to believe that, not because your theory convinced me. I said, I don't care why, just stay put. He said, get me something I can use. I didn't sleep. I sat at the radio through most of the night and I thought, and I listened, and I scanned frequencies in a way that was partly technical, and partly the restless kind of searching you do when you have a problem with insufficient information and too much at stake to leave it alone. Lily brought me coffee at around midnight. Instant, terrible, the only kind we had. She sat across from me on the rollout mat with her knees up, watching me the way she watched things, patient and gathering. She said, "You're going back tomorrow." "Yes." "Into the building." I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "You have to. You know that. 24 hours isn't enough to build another option." I said, "I know." She said, "Then you know you're going in." I set the coffee down. I said, "If I go in and something happens to me, don't. Lily, don't do the contingency speech. You can put it in the radio log if you want, and I'll read it if I have to, but don't make me sit here and listen to it tonight." I looked at her. She said, "I know what to do if something happens to you. You've been telling me for a month. I know the frequencies, and I know the maps, and I know how to manage the group. I don't need the speech." I said, "Okay." She said, "What I need is for you to be careful and come back." I said, "Okay." She said, "Carefully. Come back carefully." I went at 3 in the morning. Darren and I, same route as the day before, moving in the dark. Darren had a headlamp on red light mode that gave us just enough to navigate without destroying our night vision. We were at the relay station fence by 4:15. I had more gear this time. The directional antenna from the tower, a small, portable Yagi, I'd assembled from components and could pack folded, to see what was being transmitted on what frequencies from close range. A pair of bolt cutters from the equipment shed, a USF's issue, radio set to the frequency I'd been monitoring. The vehicle side entrance to the fence was on the east side of the compound. The main gate, padlocked. There was a smaller personnel gate on the south side, also padlocked but with a cheaper lock than the main gate. The bolt cutters dealt with the cheaper lock in about 15 seconds. We went in. The lights in the main building were still on, which meant either someone was awake or they'd left them on. We went to the building's south wall, under the overhang of a lean-to equipment shelter, and from there, I could see through a second window that this building had, on the west side, facing away from the antenna array. This window showed a hallway, lit but empty. There was a door next to the window, standard commercial steel door, push bar inside. From outside there was a handle and a lock. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I looked at Darren. He looked at me. I pushed the door open slowly, inch by inch, checking the hinge for sound. No sound. Inside, a hallway, fluorescent lights, concrete block walls painted gray-beige, the smell of diesel exhaust from a generator somewhere below us, and something else. Something organic. Not the infected specific smell that I'd cataloged in my first few encounters, which was something I wasn't going to describe any further than I had to, because the memory of it was already more present than I wanted. Different. Something like unwashed people. The way closed spaces smell when they've been occupied by stressed humans for several weeks without enough ventilation. We went down the hallway. The first room was a server room. Racks, blinking LEDs, the low hum of cooling fans. Not what I was looking for. The second room had a door that was partly ajar with light coming through the gap. I pressed against the wall and looked through the gap. 2 people asleep on cots, both in civilian clothes. both with sidearms visible on the floor next to the cots. Not military issue gear, not emergency management gear, personal weapons, the kind that people bring from home. The third room, at the end of the hallway, the largest door, also ajar, was the operations center. I could hear the person inside before I pushed the door open further. They were talking. Not to someone in the room. On a radio, it sounded like. I caught fragments. Holding at the current collection point, 7 individuals. Confirmed transport schedule on the 31st. Northern route is still clear as of last report. I pushed the door. The man at the radio desk spun around. He was maybe 50, heavyset, gray at the temples. Surprised, genuinely surprised, which told me security around this place was oriented outward, toward the fence and the approach roads, not inward, because they weren't expecting anyone to already be inside. He started to reach towards something on the desk that I assessed as probably a weapon. I said, "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I want to talk." He stopped, looked at me, looked past me at Darren. His hand was frozen midway to whatever it was reaching for. I said, "My name is Owen Garrett. I'm a former Army Signal Corps technician. I've been monitoring your broadcast for 2 weeks. I need to understand what you're doing here." Long silence. He said, "How did you get inside this compound?" I said, "That's not the relevant question. The relevant question is what happens to the survivors who show up at the Ridgemont County Fairgrounds on July 31st. His expression changed. Something that I want to carefully call complicated. Not guilty, not afraid, but the look of someone who had been holding multiple things in tension for a long time and was suddenly confronted with the possibility of having to articulate them. He said, "Sit down." I stayed standing. I said, "Tell me who you are first." He said, "My name is Garrett Wells, Federal Emergency Management, Region X, Continuity of Operations. This station is part of the FEMA COOP network." He said it in the formal way that government employees say formal things, even when they've been awake for 3 weeks, in a relay station with 3 people and a generator. "We've been running coordinated relocation operations from this station since day 4 of the outbreak." I said, "To the fairgrounds." He said, "To the fairgrounds as a collection point, not as a final destination. The fairgrounds is where transport connects from." I said, "What transport?" He said, "Road convoy, 2 buses and 3 cargo vehicles. We've been coordinating with a secured federal facility, 72 miles north. Agricultural research station, converted. Enough space, supplies, infrastructure. The convoy runs when we have enough survivors at the collection point to make the fuel cost worth it." I said, "You've been running this collection operation since day 4. How many people have you transported so far?" He said, 3 runs, total of about 160 people. I sat down. Here's what I did with that information. I held it parallel to everything I'd concluded about this broadcast over the past 2 weeks, and I looked at where the 2 things agreed and where they didn't. And what I found was that most of my technical analysis of the broadcast still held: the frequency choice, the looping structure, the lack of two-way capability. But the conclusion I'd drawn from that analysis, that the broadcast was a trap, was not the only conclusion available. Wells' explanation fit the same technical facts. Emergency management coup operation, small team, limited resources, using what they had to reach survivors and coordinate transport. What I'd read as sinister could also be read as desperate competence under resource constraints. I said, "Why didn't you build in two-way capability? Why broadcast and not also listen?" He said, "Limited equipment. 1 transmitter running on backup power. We can listen on this." He gestured at the radio desk. "But we can't do simultaneous transmit-receive on the same antenna system without risking burnout on the transmitter. So we broadcast on schedule and listen between windows." "On what frequency?" He gave me a frequency. I wrote it down. Later, I would verify that it was a legitimate secondary frequency for that band, and that it matched the propagation signature I'd been seeing. I said, "What are the security arrangements at the fairground?" He pulled a folder from a drawer. Inside were what looked like ops planning documents, hand-drawn diagrams of the fairground with positions marked. He spread them out. The security arrangement was not what I'd assumed from the description of the location. They'd done things to make it more defensible, converted vehicles into barrier walls around the main exhibition building, restricted the entry point to a single controlled approach, had a radio-equipped security team with a check-in schedule. I studied the diagrams for 2 minutes. I said, "It's still exposed." He said, "I know. It's what we had." I said, "I have a group leader with 60 people who was 30 hours from bringing them here. If I vouch for this operation, they come. But I need you to give me more. I need to know why I should trust this." He sat back. He looked tired in a way that went past sleep deprivation. He said, "You can look at everything in this room. I'll open every file. Ask me whatever you want. Then you decide." I spent 2 hours in that room. Here's what I found, and I want to be accurate about both what supported Wells and what still bothered me. Supporting. The coup documentation looked legitimate. FEMA letterhead, location codes I cross-referenced against the topographic maps I had, radio scheduling logs that were consistent with the transmission patterns I'd observed. The transport vehicle records showed 3 completed runs, with dates, head counts, and fuel consumption logs. There was a radio log of communications with the northern facility, the agricultural research station, that showed check-ins every 12 hours, going back 3 weeks. Still bothering me, the early transmission Russell had recorded, the one that said "Acknowledged, signal is good, begin coordination on schedule," did not appear in Wells's own logs. He claimed it was a frequency test with his radio partner at the northern facility. Possible, but it didn't match the log entries, which started 24 hours later. Also, the 3 people I'd found in this building, 2 asleep on cots, 1 on radio watch. Wells had said his team was small, but the 2 vehicles in the compound, the federal SUV and the pickup truck, suggested slightly more capacity than 3 people. When I asked about the others, Wells said 2 team members were out on a resupply run and were due back before the 31st. I didn't catch him in a specific lie. What I found was a picture that was mostly consistent, but had a couple of gaps in it that I couldn't fully reconcile. I made a call. I decided the weight of the evidence supported his story. The documentation was too detailed and too consistent to be fabricated on the fly. And the alternative, that someone had set up an elaborate false rescue operation within the infrastructure of an actual government facility, using real coup protocols, would require a level of resource and planning that went well beyond what I could reasonably conclude from the evidence I had. I said I'm going to vouch for this to the group I mentioned. 60 people. They should reach the fairgrounds by midday on the 31st, if they leave Kettner around dawn. Wells said, "We'll be ready for them." I said, "One more thing. When this run goes north, I want access to your HF station to send a longer-range broadcast, not your rescue message, a different message, to reach other survivor groups who might not know about this operation." He looked at me for a moment. I said, "That's the condition." He said, "I'll need to clear it with the northern facility." I said, "You have until the 31st. We went back down the mountain. Darren didn't ask me how it went, and I didn't tell him until we were in the truck and moving. And then I gave him the summary, factual, in order. He listened and asked 2 questions, and then was quiet, which was how Darren processed things. And I'd learned to trust the silence. We got back to the tower just as the eastern sky was going gray, and Pete was coming out of the cabin with a mug of something that smelled like coffee, and he took one look at me and said, "You look like you slept in a ditch." I said, "Close." He handed me the mug. I called Todd on Russell's radio at 6:15. He picked up on the second try. I said, "I've been inside Relay Station Carver. It's a FEMA coup operation. The rescue broadcast is legitimate. The fairgrounds is a collection point for a convoy to a secured facility to the north." I spent 2 hours going through their documentation. Silence for a beat. He said, "You went inside." "Yes." "How?" "I'll tell you in person. The point is the information is verified to the best of my ability. I'd say 90% confidence. The 10% is details that don't fully reconcile in their own logs, but nothing that disproves the operation." He said, 90%. I'm not going to tell you 100 if I'm not at 100. Another pause. Then, all right, we move at dawn. I said, I want to be at the fairgrounds when you arrive. He said, why? I said, because I was the one who verified it, and if I'm wrong, I'd rather know firsthand. He was quiet for a long enough moment that I thought the radio might have lost signal. Then he said, I appreciate that. The morning of the 31st was clear and very still, the kind of summer morning where the light comes in at a low angle and makes everything look slightly more permanent than it is. I'd slept for maybe 3 hours on the rollout mat and woken up with that specific kind of clear-headedness that comes from having made a decision you're not sure about, but having made it anyway. The plan I'd put together for the day: Darren and Pete would stay at the tower with Russell. Nora and Lily would come with me to the fairgrounds. I wanted Nora there because 60 people after weeks of survival conditions would need medical triage. I wanted Lily because I told myself it was because she was the second most medically capable person in our group. I also knew it was because I didn't want to leave her at the tower, and I wasn't proud of that, not strictly tactical decision. We got to the fairgrounds at 9 a.m. Wells's team was there, and the defenses were better than I'd expected from the maps. They'd worked overnight. The converted vehicles formed a real barrier around the exhibition hall's main entrance, and there were 2 people on the hall's roof, with long-range visibility. Inside the hall, the concrete floor space had been organized into sections: reception, medical triage, supplies, sleeping areas. The FEMA team member running the medical section was a compact woman in her 40s named Elaine, who wasted no time getting Nora oriented and put to use immediately. Todd's convoy arrived at 11:33 pickups, a panel van, and a school bus, orange and incongruously bright in the empty parking lot. 61 people, as it turned out. One more than the count I'd been given. A baby born 8 days ago to a woman named Donna, who was 22 years old, and had delivered in the back of a pickup truck with the help of a retired OB who'd been in Todd's group, which is either the most terrible or the most remarkably human thing I can tell you about those first weeks. Todd Page was physically what I'd constructed from Russell's descriptions and the radio voice. Medium height, dense, methodical in how he moved through space, always seeming to be taking inventory. He found me inside the hall within about 10 minutes of arriving. We shook hands. He was direct in the way that people who've been in charge of difficult things are direct. He said, "Your people are welcome to come north with the convoy." I said, "I've got people at the tower who know the area. I want to think about it." He said, "Don't think too long. Situation's not getting more stable." I said, "I know." He said, "You were right about the broadcast, by the way. The concerns, even if the operation turned out to be legitimate, your instinct to verify before committing 60 people was right. I should have agreed to the 48 hours immediately." I said, "You were carrying 60 people. It changes the math." He said, "Yeah." He looked around the hall. "It does." That afternoon, between the convoy's arrival and the scheduled departure window Wells had set for mid-afternoon, I did the thing I'd told Wells I needed to do. I went back to the relay station. He'd cleared it with the northern facility as promised. I sat down at the HF transceiver, a proper fixed station unit, ICOM IC 7300, with the full antenna array, and I transmitted on a schedule of 3 frequencies, 6 minutes on each, rotating through the most likely amateur and emergency bands, with a message I'd drafted on the drive there. The message was simple. I described the operation. FEMA Coop, secured facility north of Ridgemont, convoy system, the relay station frequency for contact. I gave the technical parameters any radio operator would need to make contact. I broadcast it 3 times on each frequency. Whether anyone heard it, I couldn't know from inside the building. I left the contact frequency and the schedule in Wells's hands and trusted the signal to go where physics would carry it. On the way out of the station, I stopped at the server room, the one with the racks and the blinking LEDs. I'd thought about this room since the first walkthrough. What was in it wasn't just server hardware. There was a communications router that I recognized from Army installations, the kind used for encrypted networking between federal facilities. If the Northern Agricultural Station had a matching unit, the connection between the 2 facilities was encrypted, which meant they were communicating on a secure channel in addition to the radio. I mentioned it to Wells on the way out. He said, "Yes. The network's been up since day 2. It's how we coordinate the transport details." I said, "Is there a reason you didn't lead with that in the conversation last night? An encrypted government network being operational changes the picture significantly." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "It changes it how?" I said, "It means this operation has more capability and more coordination than a 3-person field team usually has, which is reassuring, but also raises different questions." He said, "Owen, we're FEMA. We have infrastructure. That's the point." I said, "I know." I left. I drove back to the fairgrounds. But the server room sat in my mind, and I kept visiting it, looking at it from different angles, through the rest of that day. The convoy left for the northern facility at 2:30 p.m. 62 people, 61 from Todd's group plus Elaine, who was rotating back after 3 weeks at the Ridgemont op. 2 buses and 3 cargo vehicles in a line with a pickup truck lead and a pickup truck tail. Todd running lead. Wells watching from the fairground gate. I watched it go. Lily was standing next to me, with her arms crossed, and her jaw doing the thing it does when she's processing something large. She said, "Are you going?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "When?" I said, "When I'm sure enough." She turned to look at me. "You're at 90% sure enough." I said, "The server room is bothering me." She said, "The server room." An encrypted government network being up and fully operational on day 2 of the outbreak means someone activated COOP protocols before the outbreak was publicly known, or on the first day. Either that's rapid response, which would be impressive, or it's anticipatory, which would be something different. She looked at me. I said, "I know how that sounds." She said, "It sounds like a theory you can't verify with what you have." "Yes. So what do you do with it?" I said, "I keep it. I keep the antenna up. I listen." She said, "Owen." "What?" She said, "I want to go north with the convoy." I looked at her. She said, "Not now. I'm not asking to leave right now. I'm saying that's the direction I want this to go. We've been in survival mode for 3 weeks, and the convoy it's a real thing. You verified it. It's the closest thing to infrastructure and organized medical care that exists right now, and I want to use it." I said, "Give me a little more time." She said, "How much more?" I said honestly, "I don't know." She didn't push it further. She went to help Nora in the triage area, where 3 people from Todd's group had stayed behind. 2 ill to transport, Nora's assessment. Nora was setting up what she could for them, from the supplies in the exhibition hall. I went back to the truck and sat with my radio. 2 days later, I was still at the fairgrounds, sleeping in the exhibition hall with Nora and Lily and the 3 patients who couldn't travel, with Wells's team manning the relay station and the rescue broadcast still running its loop, when the infected came. Not a random drift. A wave. That's the only word that describes it accurately. A wave. A dense forward movement of infected individuals coming from the west, in numbers that I didn't have an accurate count for, but estimated, from the rooftop with binoculars, at somewhere between 400 and 600, which is a number that renders the fairgrounds' improvised defenses immediately theoretical. They came from the direction of Ridgemont, from the west, and I've thought about this every day since. They were following something, not our noise. We'd been quiet, operationally disciplined. Nothing in the last 48 hours that should have drawn that many from that far. But something had drawn them to the west side of Ridgemont, and then channeled them east, along Route 9, toward the fairgrounds. I was on the roof when I saw them coming through the binoculars, and I went down the ladder and found Wells and said, very specifically, 400 to 600 infected, coming from the west, on Route 9, ETA to this position, approximately 20 minutes at current pace. What's your extraction protocol? Wells went pale. Not the dramatic way. The quiet, internal way that tells you someone has just confronted the gap between their plans and the reality those plans were built to accommodate. He said, "The convoy is the extraction protocol." I said, "The convoy is at the northern facility." He said, "Yes." I said, "We have 3 patients who can't walk out. We have 5 of your team. We have 4 of us, and we have 20 minutes. He said, "There are 2 vehicles in the lot." "Yes." He said, "I know. I made a decision right there. I've made a lot of decisions in the last 7 weeks, but this one happened in a specific moment, and I remember the texture of it, the way decisions feel when there's no time to second-guess them, when the shape of the choice appears complete, and you either take it or you don't." I said, "2 of your team stay here and hold long enough to get the patients to the vehicles. The rest of us move the patients now. We drive east. Where is the next viable position east of here?" Wells said, "There's a National Guard equipment depot at the junction of Route 9 and Highway 47, 15 miles east." I said, "Is it defensible?" He said, "More than here." I said, "Then that's where we go." Here's the thing I want to say about Nora. She already had the 3 patients on their feet, or as close to feet as they could manage. She'd heard the conversation, and she'd started moving without being told, which is what 4 years of ER trauma does to a person. She was supporting the least mobile patient, a man in his 50s named Walt, as it happened, a truck driver from Todd's group who'd had a respiratory infection we'd been treating, under his arm, and she was telling him in a calm, specific way that he was going to be fine. They were going to the truck. He needed to put weight on his left leg, and she'd handle the right. Lily had the other 2 patients, a woman with a broken ankle splinted by Nora, and a teenage boy who was feverish but ambulatory, moving toward the hall's rear exit. I went ahead and opened the exit and looked at the parking lot. Clear. The 2 vehicles were a large SUV from Wells's team, and my pickup. We loaded patients. SUV took the 3 patients, and Nora and one of Wells's team. My truck took Lily and the remaining team members, plus Wells. I got in the driver's seat, and Wells got in the passenger seat, and through the windshield we could see the west-facing fairground entrance. And through the vehicle gaps in the barrier we could see, at the end of the parking lot, the first shapes coming through the perimeter. I put the truck in reverse. The 15 miles to the National Guard depot was the most sustained amount of driving I've done since the first night. And what I noticed about it was the way the road looked different now than it had on July 12th. The same road, the same trees, same signage, same topography. Different in the way that familiar rooms look different when the people who usually live in them are gone. Not frightening exactly. Hollow, like the road was the echo of a road, rather than the road itself. Lily didn't say anything for most of the drive. She had her hand on the truck door handle, not gripping, just resting. I noticed this, and I knew what it meant, and I didn't address it, and neither did she. We got to the depot. Wells had been right about its defensibility. It was a former armory-style building, concrete, with a perimeter fence in better condition than the fairgrounds barriers, and vehicle bays with steel roll-down doors, and a backup generator that, when Pete Holloway walked in 2 days later, after driving down from the tower at Darren's suggestion, he had running in 40 minutes. Pete, Darren, Russell. The tower group came down on day 2 at the depot, and I want to say that when Pete came through the gate with Darren behind him and Russell's camper van pulling up the rear, I felt something that I'm not going to name specifically, because naming it would make it smaller, but it was the thing you feel when the count comes back and everyone's there. Russell pulled me aside that first evening. He stood in the vehicle bay with his hands in his pockets, and he looked like a man preparing to be smaller than he'd been. He said, "I want to say something about the Todd situation." I said, "Okay." He said, "I should have told you I was giving him information. I should have asked first, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "I thought I was helping." "I know that too." He said, "Are we?" He stopped. I said, "We're fine, Russell. You made a decision that I'd have made differently. It caused a problem that worked out okay. We're fine." He nodded. He didn't look entirely convinced, which was right, because I wasn't entirely sure yet, but we had too much in front of us to sit in what was behind us. Week 5, the depot. The National Guard depot was not the fire lookout tower, and adjusting to it took time that I want to account for, rather than skip over. The tower had been about observation, all that height, all that view, the radio reaching out, and the world contained at a safe distance below. The depot was about something different. It was bigger, it had more capacity, and more capacity meant more people, and more people meant all the things that more people always mean. Wells stayed. His team, down to 4 operational people now after the fairground run, effectively integrated with ours. Elaine came back from the northern facility on the next convoy run, with medical supplies and 2 additional FEMA personnel, and a radio technician named Gabe, who was 26 and had worked for a private military contractor before the outbreak, and who knew radio systems in ways that overlapped with mine, and who I spent 3 days doing nothing but comparing notes with, because the comparative analysis was useful. Gabe confirmed something I'd been working toward in my own analysis. The HF broadcast from Relay Station Carver that we'd been hearing, the rescue broadcast, was not the only HF signal in the region. There was a second signal, on a slightly different frequency in the same band, that was lower power, transmitting in short, irregular bursts rather than a looping message. Gabe had been tracking it since before he came south with the convoy. He thought it was a secondary station, possibly a competitor to the Carver operation, possibly another survivor group with HF capability. I listened to his recording of the secondary signal. I said, "That's not a survivor group." He looked at me. I said, "The keying pattern." Listen, I ran the recording again. Someone with a radio background is transmitting that. The spacing between transmissions, the frequency shifts. That's not someone improvising. That's structured. It's not Morse. It's not standard digital mode. It's something custom. Gabe said, "Custom how?" I said, "Someone built their own protocol," which you do if you're trying to communicate with a specific partner in a way that general monitoring won't decode. He said, "And you think you can decode it?" I said, "I think I can characterize it well enough to make an educated guess about what it's doing. I've been in Signal Corp for 6 years. I know how people build custom protocols, and I know what the purpose usually is." He said, "What do you think the purpose is here?" I said, "I think it's directional. The signal strength pattern changes in a way that suggests either the transmitter is moving or it's encoding directional data. I think it's telling something where something else is." "Telling what?" I said, "I don't know yet. Here's the twist that I'm still sorting out how to think about. And I've had weeks to think about it, sitting up at the radio in the depot's second-floor comms room, so I should probably be further along in the sorting than I am. The secondary signal, the custom protocol HF bursts. Gabe and I spent 4 days analyzing them. We built a rough decode by running the signal through his recording equipment and mapping the timing patterns against variables we thought might be the encoding key. Time of day, signal strength, frequency shifts, interburst gaps. It's not clean code breaking. It's inference, which is a harder and less satisfying process. But what we ended up with was a picture that was consistent across multiple recordings. The signal was encoding geographic coordinates, not in any standard format, but coordinates, locations, expressed in a custom cipher that used frequency shifts as one digit system and timing gaps as another. Once we had the decode framework, Gabe ran back through every recording he had, and we pulled coordinates from all of them. They were locations of survivor concentrations, not our depot. We hadn't appeared in the signal yet, as far as we could tell. Todd's armory had appeared, twice, with coordinates close enough to be unambiguous. A farm property about 18 miles northeast, where we knew from radio traffic that a family group was sheltering. 2 other locations that corresponded to transmission sources we'd been monitoring. Someone was tracking survivor locations and broadcasting them. Broadcasting them toward something, in a specific direction. The signal had a directionality that Gabe's recording had captured with a directional antenna. It was aimed west-northwest. Somewhere in that direction was whatever was receiving these coordinates. The most chilling thing is what we found when we cross-referenced the coordinates with the patterns of the infected horde movements that Darren had been tracking. Darren had been keeping a movement log, marking on the topographic maps where we'd observed or had reports of large groups of infected moving. He'd been doing it because he was a methodical person who worked outdoors and keeping track of movement patterns in the landscape was something he did by nature. He hadn't been doing it because he thought it would reveal something specific. It revealed something specific. The horde that had come to the fairgrounds from the west, the one that had come in a directed wave rather than a random drift, had passed through a corridor that corresponded to a coordinate broadcast we could now date. The broadcast had gone out 36 hours before the horde arrived. The horde moved at roughly the pace infected move when they're following something, 2 to 3 miles per hour, sustained. 36 hours, at 2 to 3 miles per hour, pointed to an origin location about 70 to 90 miles west of the fairgrounds. Whatever was receiving the coordinate broadcasts was sending something back, something that moved toward those coordinates. I want to sit with this with you, reader, or listener, or whoever you are. I want you to sit with what that means and what it doesn't mean, because there are two versions of this, and I've lived with both of them, and they're both terrible in different ways. Version 1. Someone has found a way to direct infected. Not control in a complex sense. They're not sending commands. They're generating stimuli. If you understand how the infected respond to sound and stimulus, and you have enough range and power, you can effectively channel a population of infected in a general direction. It's not precise. It's not reliable over small scales. But over large scales, with enough of them, you can create waves. Someone is doing this deliberately. Someone is looking at survivor location data and then creating conditions that send waves of infected toward those survivors. Version 2. It's coincidence. The coordinates are being broadcast for some other purpose I haven't identified, and the horde movements are correlated, but not caused by the broadcasts. And I'm connecting things that happen to happen near each other, because the human brain is pattern-seeking in ways that aren't always accurate. I laid both versions out for the group in the depot comms room. All of them. Pete, Darren, Nora, Lily, Russell, Wells, Gabe, and 2 of Wells' remaining team members named Breckett and Howard, who were both quiet, competent people who asked good questions. The room was quiet when I finished. Pete said, "If it's version 1, what do you do?" I said, "You find the source, the receiving station, the thing that's converting coordinate data into directed stimulus. You shut it down, or you jam it, or you expose it to people who can do something about it." Wells said, "What people?" "Other survivors, networks. The northern facility has resources. If there are more COOP facilities operating, they need to know about this." Gabe said, "And if it's version 2?" I said, "Then I've been wrong and we've spent 4 days doing analysis that didn't lead anywhere, and we go back to what we were doing." Darren said, "The movement log isn't coincidence." Everyone looked at him. He said, "I've been tracking movement in this terrain for years as part of my job. Infected movement is random, except when it isn't. What I've logged over the past 5 weeks has patterns that are not consistent with random stimulus response behavior at the scale I'm observing. There's directionality, there's consistent timing between what appears to be the stimulus event and the population movement. It's not conclusive, I'll say that, but I've watched a lot of things move through this landscape and it doesn't look random." Nobody argued with Darren. Not because we thought he was certainly right, but because he was the person in the room who'd watched things move through landscapes the longest, and that counted for something. Week 6. The mission. I want to tell you about the 3 days leading up to it, because they contain things that matter. Day 38. I couldn't sleep, and I was at the radio at 3 a.m. when I picked up a transmission I'd never heard before. Not the Carver rescue loop, not the custom protocol bursts, not any of the amateur radio traffic I'd been logging. A voice, live, on a military auxiliary frequency, one of the channels I could monitor but shouldn't officially have access to, from a receiver set up to be deliberately versatile in ways the Army had taught me. The voice was giving a situation report to someone, detailing survivor population counts, locations, general health status of the groups. The locations it was giving were accurate. They matched what I knew about the survivor concentrations in the region, including some that I'd thought were only known to a very small number of people, including our depot, our coordinates, our head count, our general supply situation, which was accurate within the margin of someone's reasonable approximation. I listened to the whole transmission. It lasted 6 minutes. Then it ended. I sat at the radio for a long time. In the morning, I didn't tell the group everything. I told them we had confirmation that someone was aggregating survivor intelligence and broadcasting it on military auxiliary frequencies, and that our location had been included. I left out the part about the head count being accurate, because I didn't want to create the specific kind of paranoia that unfounded suspicion creates in small groups, and because I wasn't sure enough yet. But I looked at each person at breakfast, one by one, in the casual way I'd learned to assess people without making them feel assessed, and I thought about what I knew about each of them and what I didn't, and I found a gap. Russell. Russell had more comms gear than he'd inventoried for us. I'd seen the camper van interior, and he'd shown me the primary rig, the 100-watt mobile HF unit, but he had a cabinet behind the driver's seat that I'd never seen opened, and I'd worked around enough radio equipment to recognize a particular kind of feigned disorganization that's really selective concealment. The cabinet was about the right size for a secondary transceiver, a smaller one. I didn't confront him. I watched. Day 39. I asked Russell to help me run a cable from the comms room to a new antenna position on the depot's east corner. It was legitimate work. I needed the cable run, and he knew his way around cable management. The job took about 2 hours, and the thing I was actually doing during those 2 hours was maintaining a continuous shared field of view with Russell in a way that allowed me to observe his behavior under low stress. What I observed at 2 points during the cable run, Russell checked his watch in a way that wasn't about knowing the time. It was the checking a schedule motion, twice in 2 hours, both times within 5 minutes of looking in the direction of his camper van. I finished the cable run and went back to the comms room and sat with it. Day 40. I asked Gabe to do me a specific favor. I asked him to set up a monitor on the secondary HF frequency, the custom protocol bursts, with a directional antenna and a signal strength logger, and to do it without making it visible from outside the building. He asked why, without asking why. He set it up. I watched the logger for 6 hours. At 2:14 p.m., a burst went out. The signal strength reading on our directional antenna put the source due west of the depot, within the compound, not a mile away, not coming from the direction of Relay Station Carver. From inside the wire, from the direction of the parking area where Russell's camper van was. I went to the parking area with Darren. I knocked on the camper van's side door. Russell opened it after about 5 seconds. He was sitting in the driver's chair. The cabinet behind the driver's seat was open. Inside the cabinet, a compact HF transceiver and a laptop with a program running on it that I recognized as a digital mode software suite, the kind used for custom encoding. Russell looked at me. Then he looked at Darren. Then he looked back at me. He said, "Owen." I said, "Don't." I said it quietly, and he heard something in it that made him stop. Long silence. He said, "I need you to understand." I said, "Explain it to me." Completely. Starting from before you arrived at the tower. He started talking. It took a long time, and I won't give you every word of it, but here is what it came to. Russell had been in contact with a group before the outbreak. Not a prepper group, not a militia. A network of amateur radio operators who'd been recruited, in the year before the outbreak, by someone who'd told them they were participating in a communications resilience study funded by a private research organization. They were given specific protocols, the custom encoding, and told to log survivor information and transmit it on a schedule if a major societal disruption occurred. They were told the information would be used by a coordinating body to facilitate rescue operations. They were paid in equipment. He believed it. He'd believed it was a research study. He'd believed, when things went bad, that he was contributing to rescue coordination by logging survivor information and broadcasting it. He'd believed the network was what he'd been told it was. He said, "I started to doubt it. When you found the coordinate pattern in the burst transmissions, when we compared it to Darren's movement log, that's when I stopped transmitting. 5 days ago I stopped." I said, "You're sure?" "Yes." I said, "Show me the transmission log." He pulled up the software on the laptop. The log showed transmissions going back to day 2 of the outbreak. The last entry was 5 days ago. Nothing since. I looked at it for a long time. I said, Russell, if what you're saying is accurate, and I want to be clear that I'm not certain it is, but if it's accurate, then someone recruited a network of amateur radio operators across the region to provide real-time survivor location data before the outbreak, under cover of a research study. And that network data has been used to send waves of infected toward those locations. He looked like someone had put their hand through him. He said, I didn't know. I said, I believe you didn't know. He said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. I took his equipment, all of it. I wasn't angry, which surprised me a little. What I felt was something more like the weight of understanding a thing you were trying not to understand, finally settling down onto everything else you're already carrying. Here's what I decided, and here's why. We needed to find the receiving station, the thing at the west-northwest end of the coordinate broadcasts. The thing that was, if our analysis was correct, converting location data into some form of directed stimulus for the infected. We needed to find it, because as long as it was operational, the pattern would continue. Survivor locations would be fed into it, and horde movements would be the result. And eventually one of those movements would reach a critical population of survivors, and the loss would be irreversible. We also needed to restore long-range communications, real communications, two-way, broad spectrum, capable of reaching survivor groups beyond the 60-mile radio bubble we were operating in. Not the rescue broadcast loop, which was regional and one-directional, but something with genuine range that could reach other COOP facilities, other survivor networks, people who might be able to coordinate a response to this at a scale larger than we could manage. Both of those things pointed back to Relay Station Carver. The HF installation there was the most powerful transmitter I knew about in the region. If I could bring it fully online with the right antenna configuration and enough power, I could reach 1,000 miles in the right conditions. And from the relay station's elevation and equipment, I might be able to locate and identify the receiving station's position with enough precision to act on it. I proposed the mission to the group, all of them, including Wells, including Russell. The proposal: a team goes to Relay Station Carver, secures it if it needs securing, brings the HF system to full capability, broadcasts a region-wide alert that exposes the coordinate broadcast network and describes the pattern we've documented, and simultaneously uses direction-finding equipment to locate the receiving station for the infected horde direction system. The risks I named specifically: the access road to Carver runs through terrain that now had a significantly higher density of infected than when Darren and I had made the first trip. The relay station itself had unknown current status. Wells hadn't had contact with his team there in 4 days, which was unusual. And once we were broadcasting region-wide, we would be broadcasting our presence to the same people who'd apparently been trying to track survivors for reasons that were now, if our analysis was right, clearly not benign. Pete said, "How many people?" I said, "Small team. The value of the tower is the installation. You don't need a large force to operate a radio installation. You need 3-4 people who know what they're doing." Nora said, "Medical." "Yes." Darren said, "I'll go." Gabe said, "I need to be there. The direction-finding setup requires someone who knows the equipment." Wells said, "I'm coming." I said, "You're in charge of the depot if something goes wrong." He said, "Breckett can run the depot. I know Carver. I know every panel in that ops room. You need me." He was right, and I didn't argue. Lily said, "Owen." I looked at her. She said, "I know what you're going to say." I said, "Then I don't need to say it." She said, "You do need to say it, and I need to tell you that I'm not going to argue with you this time." I looked at her for a long moment. She said, "I'm going to stay. I'll help Breckett with the depot. I'll keep the radio going. You come back." I said, "Okay." She said, "Carefully." I said, "Carefully." The morning of day 43, we loaded the truck with the directional antenna array Gabe had put together, more sophisticated than the portable Yagi I'd been carrying, capable of real bearing resolution, plus the radio gear, tools, the Mossberg, Wells's team's 2 rifles, and the food and water for what I planned as a 2-day operation. 4 of us, me, Darren, Gabe, Wells. The road to Carver at 6 a.m. in the early light was the same road as before, and not the same road as before. 3 miles before the Carver junction, we encountered a group of infected in the road, 9 or 10 individuals, clustered in the way they cluster when they've been attracted to something that's no longer producing sound. We stopped the truck 200 yards back and waited. In 5 minutes, they drifted north into the tree line. We drove past. At the Carver junction, Wells said, "Stop." I stopped. He said, "The access road. Look at the gravel." I looked. Tire tracks. Recent. The morning dew hadn't obscured them yet. Tracks going in, not going out. I said, "Your team's vehicles?" "My team's vehicles are accounted for at the depot. Those aren't our tracks." I said, "Someone came in this morning." "At first light, maybe before." I said, "How many sets of tracks can you count?" He studied them for a moment. 1 vehicle, maybe 2 people on foot in addition. The footprints are grouped. I said, "Options." Wells thought for a second. "Well, then, there's a maintenance path that runs parallel to the access road about 300 yards north, used for equipment access before the main road was paved. It's rough, but we can get the truck part of the way. Come into the compound from the north side instead of the main gate." I said, "Does the north side have a fence?" "Yes, but it's older, weaker." I said, "Darren." Darren said, "Take me to the maintenance path and I'll tell you if we can run it." We ran it, barely. The path hadn't been maintained as anything other than occasional foot traffic, and the truck scraped bottom twice on rock outcroppings, and I'm still not sure how the exhaust system survived, but we got within 200 yards of the north fence and parked behind a rock buttress that hid the truck. On foot from there, the north fence was chain link, older, sagging in 2 places. We went over at the lowest point. Darren first, then Gabe with the equipment, then Wells, then me. Inside, we were at the back of the compound, facing the rear of the main building, antenna towers to our left. The SUV and the pickup I'd seen before were still here, where they'd been, plus a 3rd vehicle, a dark blue cargo van with no plates. The building's rear door, which opened to an equipment room separate from the main ops hallway, was closed and appeared locked from the outside. Wells had a key. He put it in. The lock turned. Inside, the equipment room. Storage, spare parts, cable reels. Quiet. The generator that I'd heard running on my first visit was silent, shut down, or out of fuel. The fluorescent lights were off. The building was on battery backup only, which meant the radio systems had maybe 2 to 4 hours of power remaining. We went down the equipment room and through the connecting door into the main hallway. The hallway was dark, except for the emergency lighting strips near the floor. Ahead of us, the server room door, open. The sleeping room door, closed. The ops center door, also closed. I went to the ops center door and listened. Nothing. I opened it. The ops center was occupied, not by Wells' missing team, by 2 people I'd never seen, both standing with their backs to the door when I came in, one at the main radio desk, and one at a secondary console I hadn't noticed on my first visit. And when they turned around, they had the look of people who'd been working, and were startled, but not panicked, which meant they were trained, which was information. One of them, the one at the main console, a man in his mid-40s with the particular stillness of someone who's made a professional habit of maintaining composure, looked at the 4 of us and looked at the weapons in our hands and said, in a level voice, "I'd appreciate it if we didn't point those at each other. None of us needs that today." I kept the shotgun up. I said, "Where's Wells's team?" He said, "The 3 people who were operating this station. They're safe. They're in one of the utility rooms at the end of this hallway. We secured them when we arrived, because we needed to work without interruption. They're unharmed." Wells said, "Who are you?" The man said, "My name is Harlan Voss. I work for a signals intelligence organization that I'm not going to name right now, because the name won't mean anything to you, and we're a long way past organizational affiliation mattering. I'm here because this relay station is the best platform in the region for what I need to do, which is, coincidentally, The same thing I believe you came here to do. I said, which is? He said, shut down the coordinate broadcast network and find the receiving station. I'm going to tell you about the next 6 hours as clearly as I can, and I want to be clear that this is the part of the story where I had the least certainty and the most things happening simultaneously. Harlan Voss was real. I want to lead with that, because everything else follows from it. He was not government, not FEMA, not military, not any agency I'd worked with or beside. His colleague at the secondary console was a woman named Jenny, who was maybe 30, and who handled radio equipment with the confident economy of someone who'd spent a long time working with it in field conditions. They'd been tracking the coordinate broadcast network for 3 weeks, from a mobile setup until they'd identified Relay Station Carver as the high-power platform they needed to run the direction-finding operation that would locate the receiving station. They knew about the receiving station. They had a theory about what it was. Not a theory I found comfortable, and I'll get to that in a moment. First, Wells's team. We got them out of the utility room. 3 people, shaken, but physically fine. They'd been secured with zip ties, which Wells cut. The team leader, a man named Cooper, gave Wells a 10-second summary and then started checking equipment status, because that's what you do. Second, generator. Pete wasn't there, but Gabe was, and Gabe had enough general mechanical knowledge to find the fuel problem within 20 minutes. Not out of fuel. A fuel line valve that had been closed, deliberately, by whoever Voss was working with, or working against. He opened it. The generator came back up. The lights came on and the radio systems came back online. Third, the conversation with Harlan Voss. He laid it out in the way of someone who's practiced explaining a complicated thing under pressure. The coordinate broadcast network wasn't just in this region. It was multi-regional. Amateur radio operators across 5 states, recruited over the preceding 18 months, all running the same custom protocol burst transmitters, all logging and transmitting survivor data. The organization behind it, Voss didn't name it, said the name was less important than the function, had anticipated a major outbreak event. Not this specific event, not on this specific date, but a class of event in this general category, and they'd built infrastructure to respond to it. Not rescue infrastructure, resource infrastructure. Survivors, Voss explained with the particular flatness of someone who'd spent too long looking at this clearly, are resources in a low population environment. They have skills, labor capacity, genetic diversity, accumulated knowledge, the ability to rebuild systems. An organization that could locate survivor concentrations, and then either recruit them or, if recruiting wasn't viable, remove them as competition for existing resources, would have a significant advantage in the long-term landscape of a post-outbreak world. The receiving station was the tool for the second option. What it was, physically, a high-power acoustic and radio frequency emitter, something that produced stimuli, specific frequency patterns that Voss described as having been developed over several years of research into what the infected respond to most reliably, and directed them toward designated locations. It converted coordinate data into directed stimulus output. It was, in the simplest possible terms, a machine for pointing infected populations at places where survivors were. Where it was, 38 miles west-northwest of the relay station. Voss had a bearing. He needed better equipment than his mobile setup to confirm the range. The relay station's direction-finding hardware, which was better than anything I'd seen outside of a dedicated signals intelligence facility, would do it. I said, if you could do all this from here, why did you wait until now to come? He said, we couldn't approach this station while Wells's team was running it, because the FEMA network has been compromised. Not fully, not completely, but whoever is running the receiving station has people inside the federal continuity network who've been feeding them survivor data from the official rescue operations, which means any FEMA-affiliated communications this station transmits are potentially being monitored. Wells said, you're saying my rescue operation has been compromised. Voss looked at him. Some of your survivor data reached the wrong people. Yes, I'm sorry. The 160 people Wells had transported north on 3 convoy runs. The coordinates of the northern facility. I said, The northern facility. Voss said, "We believe it's still secure." Yet the intelligence sharing appears to have been one-directional. They've received location data, but haven't acted on it yet in terms of the directed horde system. The northern facility is the most significant survivor concentration in the region, and moving on it prematurely would risk drawing attention to the operation. I said, "So they're waiting." "We believe so." I said, "For what?" He said, "For their position to be consolidated enough that removing the northern facility's population doesn't leave a power vacuum that competitors can fill. When they feel secure, they move." I said, "How long do we have?" He said, "Based on the transmission patterns we've logged, the schedule of the burst broadcasts, the timing of horde movements, the preparation indicators we've been tracking, we estimate 2 weeks, maybe 3. I said, "Then we find the receiving station now." The direction-finding operation took most of the afternoon. Gabe and Jenny working together at the main console with Voss directing, and me watching the process, and adding what I could when my knowledge of the frequency bands contributed something useful. What they built was a composite bearing from multiple antenna array positions, using the relay station's installation. The burst transmitter we'd been tracking from the depot sent 3 transmissions during the afternoon observation window, 3 separate chances to refine the bearing. By 4:30 p.m., we had a location accurate to within about half a mile. A valley about 36 miles west-northwest, accessible by a single paved road that went through the town of Sherbrooke before turning south on a county lane. Voss pulled a satellite image from the laptop, downloaded before communications went down, recent enough, and pointed at a structure in the valley. A farm, or what had been a farm. A cluster of buildings with what looked like, on the satellite image, large antenna structures on the property that would not have been there when the image was taken. Added after, recent. I said, "That's a significant installation for a private organization." Voss said, "They've been building it for 18 months. The farm was purchased through a shell company. The construction was permitted as agricultural equipment and communications infrastructure for remote farm operations." I said, "How many people?" He said, "Unknown. Our best estimate is 12 to 20. They're not a large operation. They're relying on the technology to do the work that would otherwise require a large force." I said, "Armed?" "Certainly. Professionally, I'd expect." I said, "What do you want to do?" He looked at me. I said, "You came here with 2 people. You secured a relay station against 3 people who weren't expecting you. That's capability, but it's not the same capability you'd need to approach an armed installation with 12 to 20 people." He said, "We came here primarily for the direction-finding capability. The plan was always to locate the receiving station and then make contact with enough organized survivors to act on that location." I said, "Us." He said, "You have a group with military training, radio knowledge, and relationships with the largest survivor organization in the region." "Yes. I was hoping to find you here, or to use this installation to reach you." Pete's voice came into my head, unbidden. The gate, and the crowbar, and the tension on hinge number 3. The way that a problem in front of you is easier than the problem behind you. I said, "Let me get on the radio first, before any of this. Todd has 61 people and 2 buses, and a group that's organized and armed. I want him in the picture." I sat down at the HF console and called on the frequency Wells used for convoy coordination, and then the frequency Todd's group used for their own radio traffic, and I got Todd in about 12 minutes, which was faster than I'd expected. I gave him the 30-second version. Location identified. Receiving station confirmed. Organization operating it is a private group with the capability and apparent intent to direct infected populations toward survivors. They need to be shut down. We have the location. Todd's radio voice was quiet for a moment. He said, "You want me to move on a private installation with 12 to 20 armed people?" I said, "I want us to move on it together. I'm not going with 3 people against 12. He said, "How confident are you in this?" I said, "The location is as solid as direction finding gets with this equipment. The organization's existence and purpose is assessed by a signals intelligence professional with 3 weeks of direct observation. The behavior pattern, Horde movements correlated with coordinate broadcasts, is documented across 6 weeks of field observation by a former Forestry Service worker whose terrain judgment I trust. He said, "That's a lot of confidence from people I've never met." I said, "One of them is the person who held your 60 people out of the fairgrounds until I verified it was legitimate." Silence. Then, "What do you need from me?" I told him, "Here's the thing about building a plan when you're running on 6 weeks of collective survival instinct and a 2-hour window to assemble something operational. It's not clean. It doesn't look like the plans I was trained to make in the Army, with time and resources and a proper staff. It looks like 4 people around a table arguing about what you're certain about and what you're not, and settling for the version that has the most confirmed assumptions and the fewest catastrophic single points of failure." What we built was this. Todd's group would provide vehicles and personnel for a blocking force, not an assault, a containment. We were going to approach the Sherbrooke Valley farm, not with the intent to storm it, but with the intent to present a position that made further operation of the receiving station untenable. Our leverage was the relay station. We had high-power HF capability, and if we went on air with a region-wide broadcast exposing the organization's coordinates, identifying the farm, and describing the receiving station technology and its apparent purpose, we turned their operational security into a liability. People who know where you are and what you're doing and why are not a resource to you. They're a threat. The negotiating position: shut down the receiving station and destroy the capability, or we broadcast everything, walk away from the farm. That was it. Voss didn't love this plan. He wanted something more aggressive, which I understood, but didn't have the resources to deliver, and didn't fully trust his judgment on might anyway. The goal was to stop the capability, not to capture or punish. Capturing or punishing required people and infrastructure, and an order of law that didn't exist right now in any meaningful sense. Stopping the capability was achievable. Todd drove his 2 buses and a convoy of additional vehicles from the northern facility, which had, it turned out, become a significant operation in the 5 weeks I'd been in the field. He had 200 people up there now, including people with actual military backgrounds, and he came south with 30 people who had relevant experience and were willing to go. We met at the Carver Junction at 5 a.m. on day 46. 38 people in total. 3 hours to the Sherbrooke Valley via the long route that kept us off the direct approach road. I drove with Lily in the passenger seat. She'd come. I hadn't asked her to stay. When I'd called the depot from the relay station to give the situation report and tell them the timeline, she'd listened and then said, "I'm coming." And I'd said, "Okay." That was the whole conversation. She had the first aid kit on her lap. She was wearing her hair back the way she wore it when she meant business, which is a thing I noticed and didn't say anything about. We drove in the pre-dawn dark with the headlights on, because stealth was less important now than speed. The convoy was 8 vehicles, moving in 2 groups with radio coordination between them. I had my radio, Gabe had his unit in the vehicle behind mine, and Todd was running communications for his group from the lead bus. The world we drove through, the same Route 9 corridor I'd first driven on July 12th evening, was different again. Not the hollow echo it had been in the immediate aftermath. Something settling had happened over 6 weeks. The emptiness was older now. The abandoned cars had sat long enough that the ones that had been in the road had been pushed to the verges by convoy traffic, and the road itself was passable, and some of the damaged storefronts had started to take on a particular quality of permanence. Broken glass you no longer expected to be replaced. Doors that were going to be open forever. I kept my eyes on the road. Lily said, at some point, with no preamble, "I've been thinking about what we do after." I said, "After today. After all of this. When there's enough stability that we're not in pure survival mode anymore. What that looks like." I said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "Medical training. There are people who need it, and not enough people who have it, and that's not going to get better on its own. I want to find a way to keep learning. Keep teaching." She looked out the window. The OB who delivered Donna's baby in Todd's convoy. She was 63. Who learns this when she can't do it anymore? I said, "Someone who decides to." She said, "Right." I drove. She said, I know you're going to say I can't do this forever. The radio monitoring and the observation posts and all of it. I said, I didn't say that. You were going to? Maybe. She said, are you going to keep doing it? I said, for a while, until there's something better to hand it to. She said, and then? I said, I don't know yet. She said, that's the most honest thing you've said all week. I said, yeah. Sherbrooke Valley, at 7:45 a.m. The farm was visible from the county road before we turned onto the approach lane, a set of metal farm buildings with those antenna structures Voss had identified on the satellite image, 4 of them, arranged on the high ground behind the main barn. From the road, in the early morning light, it looked almost ordinary. A farm. The antennas looked like they could be something agricultural, if you didn't know what to look for. We stopped the convoy a half-mile from the farm gate. I got out with Voss and Todd and Darren, and we walked the remaining distance to the gate on the farm lane, while the vehicles held back. We kept our weapons visible but lowered. There is a specific communication made by visible but lowered. I know about your weapons and you know about mine, and I'm choosing not to start something. The gate was closed. There was no one visible at it. No movement from the farm buildings. No noise. Nothing. We waited at the gate for about 4 minutes. Then a man appeared at the corner of the main barn, walking toward us, alone. He was in his 50s, wearing work clothes, and he had the careful look of someone who'd already known we were coming long enough to have made a decision about how to respond, meaning their own observation, meaning they were watching before we arrived. He stopped about 20 feet from the gate. He said, "You found us." I said, "Yes." He said, "That took longer than I expected." I said, "We weren't rushing." He said, "What do you want?" I said, "The receiving station system, offline, destroyed. The antenna installation comes down. Whatever the emitter equipment is gets physically disabled in a way I can verify." He was quiet for a moment. I said, "You know what the relay station at Carver is capable of? You know what goes out on the HF bands if I transmit from there? We have 2 weeks of documented behavior pattern, coordinate broadcasts correlating with directed horde movements. We have the name and location of your organization and this installation. That information is in a transmission package, ready to go out across 500 miles of the HF bands the moment I make a call on this radio." He said, "Destroying this equipment doesn't give you anything back." I said, "No, it doesn't." I said it without the heat. I might have said it with 3 weeks earlier. But it keeps you from using it going forward. He said, "We'll build it again." I said, "Maybe. In an environment where every survivor group in the region knows your organization exists, and knows what you were doing, and knows your methods, build it again, and see how long it stays operational." He looked at me. Then he looked at Todd, and the convoy behind us, and whatever calculation he was doing concluded. He said, "We need time to shut it down properly. The emitter can't just be cut. There's a discharge protocol, or the power system is dangerous to anyone near it." I said, "I've got a signals technician and a former electrician in my convoy. They'll watch the process." He said, "Fine." He said it the way of someone for whom fine is not the end of the story, and I know that, and I'm not under any illusion that this was a resolved situation in any permanent sense. But resolution in permanent senses is not what survival looks like. Survival looks like this: the next correct action, done to the best standard you can manage, knowing that there's a next action after it. Gabe and Pete went in. I stood at the gate. Darren was behind me. Todd had his people in a loose perimeter around the property. It took 3 hours. Pete came out twice to report status. The emitter was a purpose-built unit. Nothing I'd seen before. Professional construction, rack-mounted hardware in a climate-controlled barn that someone had converted specifically for this. It was impressive in the way that things you don't want to exist are impressive. Pete and the man from the farm, whose name I eventually found out was Balt, which struck me as a name in a story, but there it was, worked through the discharge protocol together, and I stood at the gate and listened to the radio and watched the antenna towers and thought about the shape of the next 6 months. Lily was at the convoy with Nora, doing medical checks on people who'd been in vehicles for 3 hours and needed to move around. I could hear her voice occasionally when the wind was right. The specific register she uses when she's in assessment mode. Calm and specific. Telling someone to take a breath. Checking something. Asking a question with a yes or no answer. At 11 a.m., Pete came out and said, "It's down." I said, "Verified. As verified as I can make it with what's in there." "Okay." He said, "Owen." I looked at him. He said, "The antenna structures. You want those down too?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That's going to take the afternoon, and we'll need the chainsaw from the depot convoy, and we'll need..." He started listing things in the practical, specific way that Pete listed things, and I listened to the list, and I said yes to each item, and we did the work. The antenna structures came down by 4 p.m. 4 steel towers, the tallest about 60 feet, cut at the base with equipment from Todd's convoy, and brought down into the open ground north of the barn. The sound of each one hitting the ground was specific. The low crash you don't feel in your chest, so much as you feel it in your feet, through the earth. Balt's people stayed inside for most of it. There were 9 of them total, fewer than Voss had estimated, which was either reassuring or concerning, depending on whether it meant the rest were elsewhere. I counted them before we left, and noted the count in my log. Before we drove out, I went back to the relay station one more time. I'd arranged with Wells for an hour window on the HF rig, and I used the full hour. What I transmitted, not an accusation, not a name, not an exposé. What I transmitted was information. Survivor groups in the region, their approximate coordinates, shared only with Wells' agreement, and limited to what was already broadly known. The existence of the northern facility and the convoy route, the FEMA COOP contact frequency and schedule, the current status of the Ridgemont area for anyone still in it trying to navigate out. I described the coordinate network threat in general terms, that a broadcast system had been used to track survivors and channel infected toward them, that it had been shut down, that groups should be aware the threat had existed. I gave the contact frequency for our depot. I transmitted it in voice, slowly and clearly, on 3 frequencies, twice each. Whether anyone heard it, I still don't know for certain. Propagation is unpredictable, and survivorship, of the radio listening kind, the kind that means someone with a receiver and enough antenna to pull in a signal from this range, is self-selecting. The people who were capable of receiving me were the people who'd been doing what we'd been doing, staying low, keeping the radio on, listening. I believe some of them heard it. On the drive back, I had the radio on and scanning, and at around the 80-mile mark, coming east on Route 9 in the late afternoon, I caught a transmission on one of the frequencies I'd broadcast on. Brief, maybe 30 seconds. A man's voice, calm, identifying himself as operating from somewhere I didn't recognize, saying he'd received the earlier broadcast, confirming he was making note of the convoy route and the contact frequency, and ending with, "Received and understood, out." That's it. Received and understood. I don't know where he was. I don't know how many people he was with. I know his radio discipline was good. Short, clear, no extra information. Appropriate sign-off. Somebody out there knew what they were doing. I said, quietly, to the cab of the truck, "Received and understood." Lily looked at me. I said, "Someone heard us." She said, "Good." We got back to the depot at 7:30 in the evening. The light was going low and orange over the ridge to the west, and the depot's generator was running, and Pete was already in the vehicle bay with a cup of something when we rolled in, which I don't know how he got there before us, except that Pete somehow always manages to be where he needs to be, slightly before the moment you need him there. Dinner that night was the largest meal we'd managed since the outbreak. Nora had found a way to make something from canned tomatoes and dried pasta and some dried spices from the depot's emergency supply store that was not good, but was hot and existed in enough quantity for everyone, which on a day like this is enough. We ate at the big folding tables in the vehicle bay, all of us together plus Todd's people who'd come on the mission, and it was loud in a way that felt strange after 6 weeks of careful quiet, and I sat in the middle of it and listened to the noise instead of analyzing it. Lily was across the table from me, arguing with Nora about something medical. I could catch half the words. Something about infection control protocols, some disagreement about procedure, and she had that look she gets when she's arguing something she's certain about, which is a look that hasn't changed since she was 8 years old. Pete was telling someone from Todd's group a story about the worst electrical job he ever worked, which apparently involved a commercial kitchen and someone else's instructions, and a very large mistake with a 3-phase circuit. Darren was eating with the focused efficiency of someone who spent a lot of time in the field and had never fully unlearned the habit of treating meals as fuel. Russell caught my eye from the far end of the table. He raised his cup. I raised mine. Here is where I am now. The tower, Hammond Ridge, the same 14 by 14 feet of wood and glass that I came to on the night of July 12th with my sister, and a truck full of radio gear and a very incomplete idea of what I was preparing for. I came back to it after the Sherbrooke Valley operation. Not permanently, not anymore. The group is mostly consolidated at the depot now, and the northern facility is the major operation, and Wells is running coordination out of Relay Station Carver with a proper team and the full HF capability I helped configure. The convoy north runs weekly now. Todd's people, our people, whoever else the broadcasts and the word-of-mouth network have pointed toward the route. I came back to the tower because it's where I think clearly, and because there are still things to watch from up here. The infected populations in the valley below are thinner than they were 6 weeks ago. Not gone, not close to gone, but the density is noticeably different. Without the directed stimulus system, the horde movements have returned to the erratic, stimulus-reactive behavior that is manageable at the scale we're operating at. Darren's movement logs since Sherbrooke show no organized directionality. They're just walking, the way they always walked, before someone figured out how to use that. Lily went north 3 days ago with the latest convoy. She goes to the northern facility. It has a medical wing now, and they need people who know what they're doing. And she knows what she's doing in a way that is bigger than it was on July 12th. She told me before she left that she'd be back. I believe her. I know she means it to be reassuring. And I also know there's a version of the world where she's wrong about that. And I hold both of those things, because that's what holding things accurately means now. Nora went with her. Pete is at the depot running generator maintenance, and apparently teaching 2 of Todd's people how to do electrical work, which sounds exactly right. Darren is somewhere in the forest east of here doing whatever Darren does when he has unstructured time in terrain he knows, which is probably making the kind of careful, unhurried observations that he later translates into maps. Russell is at the relay station with Wells, which is either the right place for him or an irony I haven't fully processed yet. Probably both. Gabe is at the depot. He's been talking about the northern facility's radio setup and what we could do with it if we had a better antenna configuration and the right amplifiers. And I keep telling him to write down the specifications, and I keep meaning to sit down and go through the specifications with him, and we keep getting interrupted by whatever the next immediate thing is. And at some point we're going to have to make time for the planning instead of just the response. That's what it means when things stabilize, I think. You get to plan again instead of just react. I'm sitting at the radio desk up here, and it's the morning of the 58th day, and the crow is doing something in the tree line to the east that I still haven't figured out, and the light in the left window of the cabin is dark, which means everything is fine. I've been writing this because I'm a communications technician, and communications technicians document things. We log signals. We record what came in and what went out, and what the conditions were, and what the result was. This is my log. This is what I heard, and what I did with it. On July 12th, I heard something in the space between the fireworks. A gunshot, a fragment of radio traffic with the word infected in it. 4 seconds of audio that most people would have attributed to noise. I'm not going to tell you I knew, in that moment, what it would lead to. I didn't know anything. I heard a signal, and I paid attention to it, and I made the next right decision, and then the one after that. The decisions weren't always right. Some of them were wrong, in ways that still come back at me in the hours before dawn, when the tower creaks in the wind, and the dark is doing whatever the dark does up here. I was wrong about the rescue broadcast, and it almost cost 60 people a very bad outcome. I was wrong about Russell in the specific sense of underestimating how much his good intentions had already cost us by the time I caught what he was doing. But the signals, the actual signals, the ones in the air, Those I read correctly. That's the thing I know how to do. Read signals. Determine what's noise and what's information, and what the information means, and what to do with it. There are still signals in the air that I don't understand. Voss's organization is somewhere, and it's doing something, and the receiving station system at Sherbrooke was one installation, not the only installation, and I know that, and I don't have a solution for it. The gaps in Wells' documentation that I couldn't reconcile are still there, unresolved, filed in my head under things I haven't figured out yet, rather than things that turned out not to matter. The man who said received and understood on the HF bands after my broadcast, I still don't know who he was. The crow is still at it. I've decided it's found something and is calling about it, which is the most likely explanation, though I've been watching that tree line for 6 weeks, and I have no idea what it keeps finding there. The solar panel is running. The batteries are charged. The radio is scanning on its preset rotation, county emergency aux, the amateur 2-meter simplex frequency, the FEMA COOP coordination channel, the contact frequency I broadcast, and the custom protocol HF band, where the burst transmissions used to come from, and where, since Sherbrooke, there has been nothing. Nothing is information, too. Absence of signal is data. Quiet is something you can read. I'm reading it now. There's a convoy scheduled through here in 4 days, heading north. I have a seat on it if I want it. I've been thinking about whether I want it. The northern facility, Wells said last time we talked on the radio, has expanded its antenna installation, and they need someone who knows what they're doing with the configuration. They have a proper HF rig and they need it set up properly. And they need someone to maintain it, and they need someone to run the monitoring and the communications that, at this point, are as important to the survival of the people up there as the food and the medical care. They need a communications technician. I wrote back to Wells and said I'd think about it. He said, take your time. I said I wouldn't need that long. He laughed, which came through the radio in the slightly compressed way that laughter does on HF. A little tinny, a little abbreviated, but recognizable. 4 days. I'll be on the convoy in 4 days. Right now I'm at the desk with the radio going, and the windows open on all 4 sides, and the wind in the trees below is doing its morning thing, and the valley to the west is catching the first light. And somewhere down that road is a world that's worse than it was, and also, in some specific small ways that I think are real, and not something I'm constructing to feel better, trying to become something. I wrote this for whoever finds it, not because I think I'm not coming back. I think I'm coming back. I wrote it because the signals should be documented, because what happened here happened, and the record of it is the thing that makes it real beyond my own accounting. July 12th. I heard it before anyone else. I'm glad I was listening.